Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the hidden world of Victorian women, a world of silk gowns and elegant tea parties, but beneath those beautiful dresses lay secrets so shocking, so utterly disgusting that history tried to bury them forever. Imagine never washing your hair for months, bathing only once a week if you were lucky, and doctors actually warning you that water could kill you. This is not fiction. This is the truth about how Victorian women really lived. Now, before we step into this fascinating and frankly horrifying chapter of history together, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy these deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past, would you take just a moment to subscribe and hit that like button? It truly helps me bring you more stories like this. And I am curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you cozy in a bed, sitting by a window, maybe halfway across the world? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let us walk together into the Victorian era, a time when cleanliness was not quite what we think it was. Picture this. It is a cold morning in London, 1875. A well-to-do woman wakes up in her grand bedroom surrounded by velvet curtains and mahogany furniture. She is wearing a long white nightgown, and as she sits up she faces a decision that would seem absolutely bizarre to us today. Should she bathe this week, or should she wait another week? You see, in the Victorian era, taking a bath was not the simple everyday ritual we know now. It was an event. An exhausting, time-consuming, almost dreaded event. And here is the truly shocking part. Many doctors of the time actually advised against bathing too frequently. They genuinely believed that immersing your body in water could weaken you, strip away your natural defenses, and make you vulnerable to illness. Let me paint you a clearer picture of what bathing actually meant for a Victorian woman. There was no turning on a faucet and waiting for hot water to magically appear. Oh no. First someone, usually a servant if you were wealthy, or you yourself if you were not, had to fetch water from a well or cistern. Then that water had to be heated over an open fire in the kitchen or back courtyard. Bucket by bucket, the hot water would be carried upstairs to wherever the bathing would take place. If you were among the wealthy elite, you might have had a proper metal bathtub, often lined with a linen sheet to protect your skin from the cold metal seams. But even then, filling that tub required trip after trip with heavy buckets of steaming water. Historians estimate it could take anywhere from 10 to 20 trips to fill a single bath. Can you imagine? By the time the tub was full, the first buckets of water would already be cooling. And here is something that will make you uncomfortable. The water was not steaming hot like we enjoy today. Victorian medical advice specifically warned against very hot baths, especially for women. They believed hot water was unhealthy, that it could cause fainting or, even worse, damage a woman's delicate constitution. So these baths were lukewarm at best. Lukewarm water after all that effort. Now, if you were a working-class woman, the situation was even more grim. Many families shared the same bath water. Yes, you heard that right. One tub of water for multiple family members. Father would go first, then mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the youngest child climbed in, the water was cold, murky, and frankly, revolting. There is a reason the old saying exists. Do not throw the baby out with the bath water. In those cloudy depths, you genuinely might not see a small child. Most Victorian homes did not have bathrooms as we know them. Bathing happened in bedrooms, often in portable hip tubs or sitz baths. These were smaller tubs where you would sit with just your lower body submerged, almost like sitting in a chair. The Herman Grimmer House in New Orleans, built in 1831, has a preserved bathing room that gives us a rare glimpse into this world. The room is plain, with no carpeting or wallpaper because of all the water that would splash about. Two exterior doors allowed servants to enter and exit without dripping water through the elegant interior of the house. The wealthy Grimmer family, despite having enslaved staff to help them, still only managed full plunge baths about once a week. And that was considered quite clean for the time. Once a week, let that sink in. But here is where it gets really interesting. What did people do on all those other days? They practiced something called sponge bathing or strip washing. Each morning a Victorian woman would stand at her washstand, a small table with a basin and pitcher of water, and wash her face, hands, neck, and underarms with a cloth or sponge. This daily ritual was considered sufficient hygiene for most of the week. Some historians, like Ruth Goodman, who literally lived as a Victorian for research, discovered something fascinating. She found that vigorously scrubbing your skin with a dry, rough towel could actually keep you surprisingly fresh between baths. The friction removed dead skin cells and some of the oils that cause odor. Victorian women would have done this daily, scrubbing themselves down with coarse linen towels, working up a sweat from the effort itself. It was not pleasant, but it worked better than you might think. Still, we have to be honest here. By modern standards, Victorian women would have had a certain smell about them, not necessarily the revolting stench we might imagine, but a distinct human scent that we today would find unpleasant. Remember, they were also wearing layers upon layers of heavy clothing, chemises, corsets, petticoats and dresses, most of which were never washed. But we will get to that horror in another part of our story. The medical establishment of the Victorian era had some truly strange ideas about water and health. Many prominent doctors published articles warning that frequent bathing could lead to weakness, susceptibility to colds, and even moral degradation. There was a genuine belief that the skin needed its natural oils to protect the body, and that washing too often removed this vital barrier. One medical text from the 1860s advised that ladies of delicate constitution should bathe no more than once per fortnight, and then only in water of moderate temperature, never exceeding 15 minutes in duration. 15 minutes, once every 2 weeks. That was considered medically sound advice. For women who were menstruating, the advice was even more restrictive. They were told to avoid bathing altogether during their monthly periods because cold or even lukewarm water might stop the flow and cause the blood to back up into the body, leading to hysteria or madness. We will explore the absolute nightmare of Victorian menstruation in detail later, but for now, just know that this meant some women might go 3 weeks or more without a proper bath. The class divide in bathing practices was stark and cruel. While a wealthy woman might manage her weekly plunge bath and daily sponge baths with the help of servants, poor women had virtually no access to private bathing facilities. Many lived in cramped tenement buildings with no running water at all. Public bathhouses existed in cities, but they were often crowded, expensive for a poor family's budget, and considered somewhat scandalous places for respectable women to frequent. In the industrial cities, working-class women might labour 12 hours a day in hot factories, coming home covered in sweat and grime, only to find that hauling and heating enough water for a bath was simply beyond their exhausted capabilities. Many settled for a quick wash at a communal pump or sink, if one was available. By the 1880s, indoor plumbing began to appear in wealthy homes. The Gallia House in New Orleans, completed in 1859, was one of the first homes in that city to have hot and cold running water and a flushing toilet. But this was extraordinary. Most Victorian families, even fairly well-off ones, did not have such luxuries until well into the 1890s, or even the early 1900s. Here is something that might surprise you. Despite all of this, Victorians were absolutely obsessed with the concept of cleanliness and respectability. For the middle and upper classes, cleanliness became a moral issue, a mark of good character and social standing. But their definition of clean was completely different from ours. Clean meant wearing fresh white linen undergarments, because white showed that you could afford to launder frequently. Clean meant brushing your outer clothes meticulously and keeping your home free of visible dust. Clean meant using perfume and cologne to mask any unpleasant odors. But clean did not necessarily mean bathing daily. It did not mean washing your hair regularly. It definitely did not mean what we think of as hygiene today. The Victorians were caught in a strange contradiction. They lived in an age of tremendous scientific and industrial progress. Railways connected cities, telegraph lines carried messages across continents. Yet their understanding of germs and disease was still emerging. The connection between cleanliness and health was not fully understood until the 1880s, when germ theory finally became accepted. Before that, most people believed diseases were caused by bad air, or miasmas rising from swamps and garbage. This meant that for most of the Victorian era, people did not understand why washing their hands after using the toilet or before eating was important. They did not know that the fever-killing mothers after childbirth was caused by doctors going from examining corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. When a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis suggested that hand-washing could save lives in 1847, he was mocked and eventually driven to madness and death. It would take decades for his ideas to be accepted. So when we judge Victorian bathing habits, we have to remember they were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had. A weekly bath, by their standards, was actually quite civilized. Daily sponge baths were conscientious. They were not lazy or foolish. They were simply living in a different reality with different beliefs and different limitations. But that does not make it any less shocking to our modern minds. The thought of going a week between baths, of sharing bathwater with your entire family, of doctors warning you that cleanliness might actually harm you, is almost incomprehensible. Yet millions of women lived this way, every single day, for decades. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night thinking about this. These were not just peasant women in remote villages. These were educated, wealthy, fashionable women who attended balls and operas, who were painted by famous artists, who wrote letters and diaries that we can still read today. And in those private writings, they rarely mentioned bathing at all. It was simply not something they thought about the way we do. A lady's diary from 1873 mentions taking a bath as a special occasion. Prepared a bath today, as I am to attend the Hendersons' dinner party tomorrow evening. The effort quite exhausted me, but I do wish to appear fresh. This was written by a wealthy woman with servants. For her, bathing before a special event was noteworthy enough to record. The Victorian era taught us something important, even though they did not realize it at the time. They taught us that cultural norms around cleanliness are not fixed or universal. What seems absolutely necessary and obvious to one generation might seem excessive or even harmful to another. Our great-great-grandchildren might look back at our 3-minute daily showers and think we were just as strange. But they also taught us how far we have come. The simple act of turning on a faucet and having clean hot water instantly available is a miracle that Victorian women would have treasured beyond measure. Every time we step into a warm shower without a second thought, we are experiencing a luxury that queens and countesses once could only dream of. Now, as uncomfortable as the bathing situation was, it was only the beginning of the hygiene challenges Victorian women faced. Because while they might manage a weekly bath, there was something else that went even longer between washings, something that sat on their heads every single day, growing heavier and greasier with each passing week: their hair. And the story of Victorian hair care is somehow even more disturbing than their bathing habits. But that is a tale for our next chapter. And trust me, you're not going to believe what these women did to their crowning glory. So we arrive at what might be the most shocking hygiene secret of Victorian women: their hair. And I want you to really think about this for a moment. When was the last time you washed your hair? Yesterday? This morning? Maybe it's been 2 days and you're feeling a bit greasy. Now imagine going an entire month. 4 whole weeks without washing your hair even once. For Victorian women, this was not neglect, this was normal. This was in fact recommended by medical professionals and beauty experts of the time, and the reasons why will make you understand just how different their world was from ours. Let me take you into the bedroom of a Victorian lady on a Saturday morning in 1882. Her name is Eleanor, and she is 26 years old, unmarried, living with her parents in a respectable home in Boston. Today is washing day, not laundry day, hair washing day, and Eleanor has been dreading it all week. You see, Eleanor's hair reaches past her waist when it is let down. It is thick, dark brown and heavy. In Victorian society, a woman's hair was called her crowning glory. The longer and healthier it was, the more beautiful she was considered. Hair was a symbol of femininity, vitality, and even virtue. A woman's hair was so precious, so intimate, that she would only let it down completely when she was alone with her husband. Otherwise, it stayed pinned up in elaborate styles, hidden from the world. But here is the problem. Washing hair like Eleanor's was not a simple task. There was no shampoo as we know it, no conditioner, no blow dryer. The process would take the entire day, and the results would leave her vulnerable to catching cold, which in an era before antibiotics could be genuinely dangerous. So Eleanor begins her ordeal. First, she must prepare her washing mixture. Some women use several raw eggs, cracking them over their heads and working the slippery whites and yolks through their hair like a primitive shampoo. Can you imagine? The smell alone must have been dreadful. Others preferred a mixture of vinegar diluted with water, which at least had the benefit of cutting through grease. Rosemary water was popular among those who could afford it. Some women swore by black tea, believing the tannins strengthened the hair. And yes, some even used rum or other spirits, probably because the alcohol helped dissolve oils. Eleanor, being a practical New England woman, uses the egg method that her mother taught her. She sits by the wash basin, tilts her head forward, and breaks 6 eggs over her scalp. The cold, slimy sensation makes her shudder every time. She works the egg through her hair, massaging her scalp, trying to reach every strand. Her arms ache from the effort. It takes a good 20 minutes of work before she feels it has reached everywhere. Now comes the rinsing, and this is where the real ordeal begins. Remember, there is no shower. Eleanor must rinse her hair using pitchers of water, pouring them over her head again and again, trying to remove every bit of egg. If she leaves any residue, her hair will smell rotten within days. The water is cold because her mother insists that cold water makes hair shinier. Eleanor has lost count of how many pitchers she has used. 10? 15? Her neck aches from bending over the basin. Water has splashed everywhere, soaking her dressing gown and the floor. Finally, she believes she has rinsed out all the egg. Her hair hangs in heavy wet ropes down her back, and now begins the longest part, the drying. She wraps her hair in towels and sits by the fire, but even with the heat, it will take hours for hair this long and thick to dry. 6 hours, 8 hours, sometimes more. During this time, she must stay indoors, avoiding any drafts that might give her a chill. She cannot put her hair up because it needs to air out. She cannot go about her normal activities because the wet weight gives her a headache. This is why Victorian women washed their hair so infrequently. It was not laziness. It was pure practicality combined with genuine medical concern. A book on hygiene and beauty from 1889 explicitly advised that ladies with oily hair should wash every 2 weeks, while those with normal hair need only wash once per month. Once per month. Medical professionals genuinely believed this was healthiest. But what about the time between washings? How did Victorian women manage the inevitable grease, the itching, the smell? They had tricks, and some of them were quite ingenious, while others were absolutely disgusting. Many women used dry shampoos made from powders. These were not like our modern aerosol dry shampoos, though the principle was similar. Victorian dry shampoo was usually made from arrowroot powder, orris root powder, or even simple cornstarch mixed with finely ground lavender or rose petals. A woman would sprinkle this powder onto her scalp, work it through with her fingers, then brush it out vigorously. The powder absorbed some of the oil and the brushing distributed the remaining natural oils through the hair shaft, giving it shine. Brushing was absolutely critical to Victorian hair care. Women were advised to brush their hair 100 strokes every single night before bed. This served multiple purposes. It distributed the scalp's natural oils, which in the absence of regular washing acted as a natural conditioner. It removed dust and tiny debris that accumulated during the day, and it stimulated blood flow to the scalp, which Victorians believed promoted hair growth. Can you picture it? Every single night, women across America and Europe sat before their mirrors in their long nightgowns, counting out 100 brush strokes. It must have been meditative for some, monotonous for others, but they did it religiously because their hair was that important. Now, here is something that will make your scalp crawl. Victorian women kept their hair pinned up in elaborate styles for days, sometimes weeks at a time. These were not simple buns or ponytails. These were architectural creations, braids coiled and pinned, curls arranged and secured with dozens of hairpins, pads of false hair added for volume, decorative combs and ornaments woven throughout. Creating one of these hairstyles could take 2 hours or more. If you had a lady's maid, she would do it for you. If not, you learned to do it yourself with the help of mirrors and incredible patience. Once it was done, you did not take it down lightly. Women would sleep with their heads on special hard pillows designed to preserve their hairstyles. They would wrap their hair in scarves or nets to protect the arrangement. Think about what this means. Hair that has not been washed in 3 weeks, pinned up tight against the scalp for days at a time, accumulating sweat, dust, powder, and the natural oils constantly being produced. The itching must have been incredible, and yes, lice were a constant problem, though polite society never spoke of it. A diary entry from a young woman in 1806 gives us a rare glimpse into this reality. She writes, "My scalp itches abominably, but I cannot take down my hair as I have the Weston's ball tomorrow evening, and mother spent 2 hours arranging it yesterday. I must endure until Saturday when I may wash it properly." She suffered with an itching scalp for days rather than undo an elaborate hairstyle. The wealthy had a slight advantage here. They could afford to have their hair styled more frequently by professional hairdressers or skilled maids. Some even had their own personal hair care servants whose entire job was maintaining the mistress's crowning glory. But even these privileged women rarely washed their hair more than once a week, and weekly was considered almost excessive by many. There was also a social element to hair that we have completely lost today. A Victorian woman would never, ever let down her hair in public or in the presence of men other than her husband. Loose, flowing hair was considered shockingly intimate and sensual. It was reserved for the privacy of the bedroom, just for her husband's eyes. This meant that most Victorian women went through their entire public lives without anyone ever seeing their hair fully loose. Your closest female friends might see it when helping you prepare for bed during a visit, or if you shared intimate spaces. But otherwise, your hair was always up, always pinned, always controlled. There is something almost tragic about this, is there not? This thing that was so prized, so carefully maintained, so central to a woman's beauty, and yet it had to remain hidden. A woman's crowning glory that almost no one was allowed to see crowned. The quality of your hair did signal your social class and health, though. Healthy, shiny, thick hair required good nutrition, which poor women often lacked. The elaborate hairstyles required time and assistance, which working women did not have, so in a way, your hair was a visible marker of your privilege, even when pinned up and hidden. As the Victorian era progressed into the 1890s and early 1900s, commercial hair products began to appear. The first manufactured shampoos were sold, though they were nothing like our modern formulas. Early shampoos were often soap-based and harsh, leaving hair dry and brittle unless followed by acidic rinses of vinegar or lemon juice to restore the pH balance. But even with these new products available, the cultural habit of infrequent washing persisted. Old medical advice dies hard, and many women continue to believe that washing too often would damage their hair or make them ill. It was not until well into the 20th century, with advent of indoor plumbing, efficient water heaters and gentler shampoo formulations, that daily or every other day hair washing became common. Here is something that really strikes me about this whole situation. Victorian women were caught between competing ideals. Society told them their hair was their crowning glory, the pinnacle of their beauty, something to be treasured and displayed. But that same society gave them almost no practical way to keep it clean and healthy by our standards. They were supposed to have glorious hair while rarely washing it, while pinning it up so tightly that it never saw the sun, while using harsh products and heat styling that we now know causes damage. And yet, if you look at Victorian photographs, and remember, photography was still quite new and special, so people looked their absolute best. Many women have truly beautiful hair in those images. Thick, lustrous, obviously well cared for. They were working with what they had, and many of them achieved remarkable results. But I cannot help thinking about the discomfort, the itching, the greasiness after 2 weeks, the heaviness of hair that has not been properly cleansed in a month, the smell which no amount of powder and perfume could completely mask. And this, my friends, brings us to another aspect of Victorian women's hygiene that was even more taboo, even more hidden, even more uncomfortable to discuss. Something that happened to women's bodies every single month, and something they had to manage with virtually no proper products, no understanding, and absolutely no permission to speak about it publicly. Yes, we need to talk about menstruation in the Victorian era, and I warn you now, this is going to be rough. Because if you thought monthly hair washing was bad, wait until you hear how Victorian women dealt with their monthly periods. There is perhaps no topic more hidden, more whispered about, more deliberately erased from Victorian history than menstruation. If you think the bathing and hair washing were shocking, I need you to prepare yourself for this. Because what I am about to tell you is so uncomfortable, so difficult, that even now, more than a century later, we still struggle to talk about it openly. But we need to talk about it. Because millions of women lived through this reality every single month, and their suffering was profound. Imagine being a young girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old, living in rural Missouri in 1870. You wake up one morning and discover blood on your nightgown. You're terrified because no one has told you this would happen. Your mother never explained it. The older women in your family never mentioned it. You genuinely believe something is horribly wrong with you, that perhaps you are dying. This was the reality for countless Victorian girls. A woman born in 1892 later recalled that when she got her first period, her aunt simply handed her some cloth rags and told her to figure it out. No explanation, no comfort, just, "Here, use these," and a wall of silence. She thought she'd been injured somehow and was too ashamed to ask more questions. The Victorian era had many terms for menstruation, but they never used that actual word in polite conversation. It was called the monthlies, or monthly sickness, or simply being unwell, or poorly. Some women referred to it as their terms, or said they had got their rags up. In more genteel circles, a woman might say she was indisposed, and everyone would understand without further explanation needed. But here is what makes this so much worse. Victorian society did not just avoid talking about menstruation. They built an entire mythology around it that made women's lives genuinely more difficult and dangerous. Medical texts of the era described menstruating women as weak, hysterical, and physically compromised. Doctors warned that during menstruation, a woman's entire system was in upheaval, her nerves were unstable, and she was vulnerable to illness and madness. This led to some truly bizarre restrictions. Women were told they must not bathe during their periods because water could stop the flow, causing the blood to back up into the body and poison the brain. They were forbidden from washing their hair. They could not drink cold water. They should not go outside in damp weather. They must not exert themselves. Some medical advice even suggested women should not read difficult books or engage in complex thinking during menstruation because it would overtax their already strained systems. Can you imagine being told that once a month for several days you must essentially pause your life because your body is too fragile to function normally? And on top of all these restrictions, you still had to manage the bleeding itself with virtually no proper products. Let me tell you how most Victorian women handled their periods, and I warn you, this is not pleasant. The most common method was homemade cloth pads, sometimes called rags or napkins. These were pieces of fabric, often old sheets, worn-out clothing, or flour sacks, that women would cut, fold, and shape into absorbent pads. If you were fortunate and had some sewing skills, you might hem the edges to make them more durable. If you were poor and pressed for time, there might just be rough, torn pieces of cloth. These rags would be folded to create thickness, then positioned between the legs and held in place by, well, this is where it gets complicated. Remember those split-crotch pantaloons we mentioned earlier? Victorian underwear was not like our modern underwear. It was essentially two separate legs connected at the waist with a completely open crotch. This design was actually practical for using the toilet while wearing multiple layers of clothing, but it was terrible for holding menstrual pads in place. So women improvised. Some pinned the rags directly to their innermost petticoat. Some used strips of cloth tied around the waist and legs to create a makeshift belt system. Others simply tucked the rags into place and hoped for the best, changing them frequently and walking very carefully. It was uncomfortable, unreliable, and required constant vigilance to prevent leaks. And when I say constant vigilance, I mean it. Imagine wearing layers of petticoats and a heavy skirt, never being quite sure if the cloth pad between your legs has shifted or if you have bled through. Victorian women lived in fear of the humiliation of a visible stain. They developed elaborate strategies, always sitting with their skirts arranged just so, moving carefully to avoid dislodging their makeshift pads, making frequent trips to check and change their rags. Here is something that will break your heart. Poor women and working-class women often did not have enough cloth rags to manage properly. If you were a factory worker or a servant, you might only have 2 or 3 rags total. You would wear one while washing another, constantly cycling through this miserable routine. But if you were truly impoverished, you might have only 1 rag, which meant washing it and trying to dry it enough to use again within hours. In factories and mills where women worked long hours, the situation was absolutely nightmarish. Historical records from the 1880s describe how factory floors were covered with straw or sawdust partially to absorb the oil and debris from machines, but also to absorb menstrual blood because many women simply had no choice but to free bleed into their clothing. Can you comprehend that? Standing at a machine for 12 hours bleeding through your clothes, with nothing but straw on the floor to catch what seeped through your skirts. For homeless women or those in workhouses, it was even worse. Many had no access to rags at all and simply bled into their clothing month after month, the stains permanent reminders of their poverty and lack of dignity. But even middle-class and wealthy women struggled with this. Having money bought you more cloth rags and perhaps a servant to help wash them, but it did not solve the fundamental problem. Those cloth rags had to be washed after use, and this presented its own challenges. Menstrual blood is notoriously difficult to wash out. Victorian women would soak their used rags in cold water, sometimes with salt added, then scrub them by hand before boiling them to sterilize and whiten them. But where did they do this washing? And where did they dry these intimate items? A woman could not simply hang her menstrual rags on the clothesline in the backyard for all the neighbors to see. That would be utterly scandalous. So they washed them in private, usually in their bedrooms, and dried them discreetly, often draped over a chair near the bedroom fire, or tucked away where no one else would see. For women who shared bedrooms or lived in crowded conditions, even this small privacy was impossible. A Victorian woman's diary from 1873 includes this poignant entry. Most unwell today, the usual difficulties with the cloths. Her mother is cross because I use too much water for washing them. Cannot go to the church social this evening. Made an excuse about a headache. The shame and practical difficulties combined to isolate women during their periods. By the 1890s, some commercial options began to appear. The Sears Roebuck catalogue from 1897 advertised sanitary napkins made from cotton gauze and bandage material, rendered antiseptic. They cost 40 cents for a box of 12, but even though these were available, many women did not purchase them. The taboo was too strong. Imagine walking into a store and asking to buy sanitary napkins. It were mortifying. Most women continued making their own at home. The catalogue also advertised something called the Ladies' Elastic Doily Belt, which was specifically designed to hold sanitary napkins in place. It was a belt made of soft sateen, with a rubber band across the hips and 2 clips, one in front and one in back to secure the napkin. This was revolutionary. For the first time, women had a somewhat reliable way to keep pads in position. But again, buying such an item required overcoming tremendous shame. Many women ordered it from catalogues specifically to avoid face-to-face transactions. Even the language in these advertisements reveals the extreme discomfort surrounding the topic. They never said menstruation or period. They used euphemisms like convenient and healthy when traveling or for special times. Everyone knew what they meant, but no one would say it directly. Now, here is something that historians have discovered that sheds light on why Victorian women may have had fewer periods than we do today. Due to poorer nutrition, particularly among working-class women, many started menstruating later, perhaps at 15 or 16 rather than 12 or 13. They also reached menopause earlier, often in their early 40s. Additionally, women who are malnourished or undernourished often experienced irregular or absent periods, and since many women spent much of their adult lives either pregnant or breastfeeding, both of which suppress menstruation, the total number of periods in a Victorian woman's lifetime was significantly lower than a modern woman's. But this does not mean their burden was lighter. Each period they did have was still managed with those crude cloth rags, still surrounded by shame and silence, still accompanied by painful restrictions on their activities. The medical advice around menstruation was not just inconvenient, it was sometimes dangerous. Remember how women were told not to bathe during their periods? This meant that during the days when cleanliness was most important, they were forbidden from washing properly. The discomfort and hygiene issues this caused are difficult to even imagine. There were also strange beliefs about what would happen if menstrual blood was not allowed to flow freely. Doctors genuinely believed that if the flow was somehow interrupted or stopped, by cold water, by overexertion, by emotional shock, the blood would back up in the body and cause hysteria, madness, or even death. This was not fringe medicine. This was mainstream medical opinion published in respectable journals. As a result, menstruating women were treated as semi-invalids. They were expected to rest, to avoid excitement, to limit their activities. For wealthy women who did not need to work, this might have been possible, though surely frustrating. For poor and working women, it was impossible. They had to keep working, keep caring for their children, keep managing their households, all while dealing with their periods and the conviction that they were risking their health by doing so. There is something deeply cruel about how Victorian society handled menstruation. On one hand, it was considered so private, so shameful that it could not be mentioned or discussed. On the other hand, women were given no real support or solutions for managing it. They were supposed to suffer silently and figure it out themselves, passing down inadequate knowledge from mother to daughter in whispers. And the suffering was real. Without proper products, women dealt with constant leaking, staining, discomfort, and chafing. Without the ability to bathe, they dealt with odor and hygiene issues. Without open discussion, they dealt with fear and confusion, never sure if what they were experiencing was normal. By the early 20th century, things began to change. Nurses during World War I noticed that the cellucotton bandages they used on wounded soldiers were excellent at absorbing blood. After the war, a company called Kimberly-Clark adapted this material to create Kotex, the first widely successful disposable sanitary napkin. It was introduced in 1920 and gradually, slowly, the stigma began to ease. But for the women of the Victorian era, no such relief existed. They managed as best they could with rags and pins and constant vigilance. They endured the shame and the silence. They survived month after month, year after year. When I think about this, about all those millions of women dealing with their periods in such primitive conditions, it makes me grateful for things I usually take for granted. Modern menstrual products are not perfect, and we still have a long way to go in terms of menstrual equity and ending period stigma. But we have come so far from those folded rags and cloth belts. Victorian women deserved better. They deserved products that worked. They deserved honest medical information. They deserved to not feel ashamed of a natural bodily function. But they got none of those things, and yet they persevered. Of course, managing menstruation was not the only bathroom-related challenge Victorian women faced. Because we have not yet talked about the daily, multiple times per day necessity that every human faces, yes, we need to discuss Victorian toilets, or rather, the lack thereof. And when you understand what Victorian women went through just to use the bathroom, you will never complain about a public restroom again. I need to tell you about something that every single Victorian woman dealt with multiple times every day. Something so basic and necessary that we never think twice about it now. But in the Victorian era, this simple human need became a complicated, uncomfortable, and sometimes genuinely hazardous ordeal. Using the toilet. I know, this might seem like a strange thing to focus on, but trust me, when you understand what Victorian women went through just to relieve themselves, you will gain a whole new appreciation for modern plumbing. Because what they dealt with was not just inconvenient, it was often humiliating, always uncomfortable, and sometimes downright dangerous to their health. Let us start with the most basic question. Where did a Victorian woman go when nature called? The answer depended entirely on her social class, where she lived, and what time of day it was. But regardless of the circumstances, it was never simple. For most of the Victorian era, the majority of homes did not have indoor bathrooms. Even wealthy families in grand houses often relied on chamber pots and outhouses well into the 1880s. Can you imagine living in a mansion with velvet curtains and crystal chandeliers, but still having to go outside to a wooden shack when you needed the toilet? Chamber pots were the most common solution for nighttime needs. These were ceramic or metal bowls, usually with handles, that were kept under the bed or inside a special piece of furniture called a commode or close stool. The commode looked like a regular chair or small cabinet, but it hid a chamber pot inside, Some were quite elegant, made of fine wood with cushioned seats, but no amount of decorative carving could change what they were. Pots that you urinated and defecated into right there in your bedroom. Now, picture this scene. It is 3 o'clock in the morning in winter, 1875, in a Chicago townhouse. Margaret wakes up with an urgent need to urinate. She is wearing a long flannel nightgown and sleeping in a bedroom she shares with her younger sister. The room is freezing because there is no central heating, just a fireplace that has long since burned down to embers. Margaret does not want to wake her sister, so she moves quietly. She slides out of bed, her bare feet touching the icy floor. She feels under the bed for the chamber pot, pulls it out, and here is where it gets complicated. She is wearing that long nightgown that goes all the way to her feet. She has to hike it up, squat or sit over the pot in the darkness, and try to aim correctly. In summer, this might not be so bad, but in winter, in a dark, freezing room, trying to be quiet, it is genuinely difficult. And then comes the truly unpleasant part. That chamber pot now contains urine, and it will stay there until morning when someone, usually a servant if you have one, or Margaret herself if you do not, carries it through the house to empty it. Where? Perhaps out a back door to dump in a pit or privy in the yard. Perhaps into a basement cesspool if you have indoor plumbing of that primitive sort. Can you imagine starting your day by carrying a sloshing pot of your own waste through the house? The smell, the risk of spilling, the sheer indignity of it. This was daily life for Victorian women. For wealthy families with servants, the lady of the house might never have to empty her own chamber pot, but she still had to use it, and she still had to live with the knowledge that a servant was handling her most intimate waste. The Victorian era was obsessed with propriety and privacy, yet this aspect of life demolished any illusion of such things. Now let us talk about daytime toileting, which presented an entirely different set of challenges. During the day, most people used an outhouse or privy, a small wooden structure built over a pit in the backyard. These ranged from rough shacks with a simple hole cut in a bench to more elaborate 2- or 3-seater models that allowed multiple family members to go simultaneously. Yes, you read that correctly. Multi-person outhouses were common, especially in larger families or boarding houses. Imagine needing to use the privy and discovering your brother is already in there. In many homes, you would just go in and use the second hole. Privacy was a luxury most people could not afford. The outhouse experience was unpleasant in ways that are hard to fully convey. In summer, the smell was overwhelming. Flies buzzed constantly. The heat made the stench even worse, and you would try to hold your breath the entire time you were in there. In winter, it was a different kind of torture. Going outside in the freezing cold and snow, sitting on a wooden seat that felt like ice against your skin. Wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Some families kept a chamber pot indoors during the coldest months just to avoid this ordeal. And then there was the question of what you used to clean yourself afterward. Before the 1870s, there was no such thing as toilet paper as we know it. So what did people use? The most common options were pages torn from old catalogues or newspapers, corn cobs if you lived in a rural area, or sometimes just nothing at all. Let that sink in for a moment. Old newspaper might seem reasonable until you remember that 19th century newspaper was rough, unsoft, and the ink would smudge all over your skin. Catalogue pages were slightly better. The Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogues were actually popular for this purpose, and there are jokes from that era about people ordering from the catalogue and then using the catalogue itself in the outhouse. But these were still rough paper, nothing like the soft tissue we use today. Corn cobs, for those who are unfamiliar, are the hard inner part of corn after you remove the kernels. They are rough, scratchy, and exactly as terrible as they sound. But in rural areas, they were free and readily available, so people used them. The first commercial toilet paper squares were sold in the 1870s, and they were marketed as medicated with chemicals added to help reduce bathroom odours. But they were expensive, and many people considered them an unnecessary luxury. The toilet paper roll as we know it was not invented until 1801, and it did not become truly commonplace until well into the 20th century. For women specifically, using the privy presented special challenges because of their clothing. Remember, Victorian women wore multiple layers, chemise drawers, corset, petticoats, and then the outer dress. When nature called, they had to manage all of these layers. This is where the design of Victorian underwear becomes relevant again. Those split-crotch drawers that seem so strange to us were actually somewhat practical. Because the crotch was completely open, a woman could simply gather up her skirts and petticoats, hold them out of the way, and squat over the toilet hole without having to remove or pull down her underwear. She just had to position herself carefully and hover. Think about this. Victorian women were expected to be delicate, refined, ladylike, but multiple times a day they had to hike up layers of heavy skirts, balance themselves over a hole, and essentially hover squat while trying to maintain their balance. This required genuine physical strength and coordination. There was nothing delicate about it. And this is not even addressing the problem of using the toilet when you were wearing a corset laced so tightly you could barely breathe, or when you were pregnant, or when you were elderly and less steady on your feet. Victorian chamber pots and privies were genuinely hazardous, especially at night or for those with limited mobility. By the 1850s, some wealthy urban homes began installing water closets, the earliest form of indoor flush toilets. But these early versions came with their own set of horrifying problems. Most of them drained into cesspools in the basement of the house. These were large pits, sometimes lined with brick, that collected all the household sewage. The idea was that the liquid would gradually seep away into the surrounding soil, while the solid waste would accumulate and need to be emptied periodically. But in practice, these cesspools were disaster zones. They filled up quickly, especially in large households. The smell would seep back up through the pipes and into the house, and when they needed to be emptied, it was a nightmare. Enter the night soil men, workers whose job was to empty cesspools and cart away the human waste. They were called night soil men because by law in most cities, they were only allowed to do this work at night, when their disturbing task would not offend the sensibilities of respectable people going about their day. These men would come in the darkness, dig into the cesspool, shovel out the accumulated sewage, load it into carts, and haul it away to be sold as fertilizer to farmers outside the city. Can you imagine living in a fine house trying to maintain an image of respectability and refinement, but knowing that several times a year, men would come in the night to dig out your family's accumulated waste? The smell during this process was so overwhelming that families would often leave their homes and stay with relatives for the night. And even between emptying, the cesspools posed constant problems. They leaked, contaminating water wells. They cracked, causing sewage to seep into basements. They overflowed during heavy rains, flooding homes with waste. There were documented cases of people, including children, falling into cesspools and drowning in sewage. It was horrific. In 1858, London experienced what came to be called the Great Stink. The summer was unusually hot, and the Thames River, into which much of the city's sewage flowed, became so overwhelmingly putrid that the smell shut down Parliament. Lawmakers literally could not work because the stench was so unbearable. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung in the windows, but nothing helped. This crisis finally forced the government to invest in a modern sewer system designed by engineer Joseph Basil Jett. His system of underground sewers carried waste away from the city, dramatically improving public health and eliminating the constant presence of sewage in streets and homes. It was one of the greatest public health achievements of the era, but these improvements came slowly and reached wealthy areas first. Working-class neighbourhoods often waited decades for proper sewers. and rural areas remained largely unchanged well into the 20th century. For most Victorian women, for most of the era, the outhouse and chamber pot remained the only options. Let me share with you a story that really brings this home. There is a preserved Victorian diary from a woman named Sarah, who lived in rural Pennsylvania in the 1880s. She kept meticulous records of her daily life, and in one entry from January, she writes about a particularly brutal winter storm that made it impossible to reach the outhouse for 3 days. The family had to rely entirely on chamber pots, which they could not empty because of the snow. She describes the smell in the house becoming unbearable, the humiliation of it all, and her relief when the storm finally broke and they could empty everything. This was life. This was normal. Victorian women, for all their supposed delicacy and refinement, dealt with this reality every single day. For women who lived in cities and had to go out for work or social obligations, the situation was even more complicated. Public toilets barely existed. If you were out shopping or at a social event and needed to use the toilet, your options were extremely limited. Some wealthy homes had facilities for guests, but using them meant asking your host, which was mortifying. Many women simply trained themselves to hold it for hours, which must have been genuinely painful and unhealthy. There are accounts of Victorian women at long church services, at balls that lasted until dawn, at day-long shopping excursions, with no access to toilets. They would try not to drink much before going out. They would suffer through the discomfort, and they would rush home the moment they could, desperate for relief. The whole situation was made worse by the intense shame and secrecy surrounding bodily functions. Victorian society pretended that respectable women did not sweat, did not have body odor, and certainly did not urinate or defecate. The reality that they did all these things, just like everyone else, had to be hidden and denied. This denial extended even to medical care. Women who developed urinary tract infections or other problems related to poor toilet hygiene often suffered in silence rather than discuss such indelicate matters with a doctor. Chronic constipation was epidemic among Victorian women, partly due to poor diet and tight corsets, but also because the social shame around defecation meant women would try to go as infrequently as possible. By the 1890s and into the early 1900s, indoor plumbing with proper sewage systems began to spread, at least in urban areas and among those who could afford it. Bathrooms as we know them, with flush toilets, sinks and bathtubs all in one room, started to appear in new construction. This was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time, people could take care of their bathroom needs with privacy, comfort, and a reasonable degree of hygiene. But this progress came slowly. Many Victorian women lived their entire lives never experiencing indoor plumbing. They were born into a world of chamber pots and privies, and they died in that same world, never knowing the luxury of a private, clean, comfortable bathroom. When I think about all of this, the chamber pots carried through the house each morning, the freezing trips to the outhouse in winter, the newspaper squares and corn cobs, the cesspools full of sewage under elegant homes, the constant smell and discomfort and indignity of it all, I am struck by how much we take for granted. The simple act of using a clean private toilet with soft paper and running water to wash our hands afterward is a luxury that Victorian women could barely imagine. They managed, they survived. But at what cost to their comfort, their health, their dignity? Every single day, multiple times a day, they faced this challenge, and they were expected to do it all while maintaining an appearance of delicate, refined femininity. The disconnect between the image and the reality was staggering. Of course, the toilet situation was not the only area where Victorian women's reality failed to match their delicate image, because while they were managing these daily indignities, they were also pursuing beauty through methods that were not just uncomfortable or inconvenient, they were literally poisonous. And that brings us to perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian women's hygiene: what they put on their in the name of beauty. What I am about to tell you sounds like something from a horror story, but I promise you every word is historically documented truth. Victorian women, in their desperate pursuit of beauty, literally poisoned themselves. Not accidentally, not through ignorance. Well, partly through ignorance, but also partly knowing full well that what they were using was toxic and choosing beauty over safety anyway. The Victorian beauty ideal was very specific, very strict, and very pale. Extremely pale. The paler your skin, the more beautiful you were considered, because pale skin signalled that you did not have to work outdoors. You were wealthy enough to stay inside, refined enough to avoid the sun. Pale skin was a class marker, a status symbol, and a sign of virtue and purity. But here is the problem. Not everyone is naturally pale. Sun exposure, genetics, and simple biology meant that achieving that translucent, almost ghostly pallor required help, and the help that Victorian women turned to was arsenic, lead, and mercury. Literal poison applied to the face, sometimes eaten, sometimes absorbed through the skin day after day, year after year. Let me introduce you to a woman named Clara. She is fictional, but her story is based on real accounts from the 1880s. Clara is 24 years old, living in Philadelphia, and desperately wants to be beautiful according to the standards of her time. Her skin has a slight olive tone that she considers a defect. She has freckles, which in the Victorian era were seen as shameful blemishes that ruined a woman's complexion. So Clara does what thousands of other women did. She orders Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers from the Sears Roebuck catalogue. The advertisement promises that these wafers will give her a clear, transparent and beautiful complexion, and assures customers that they are perfectly safe and absolutely harmless. The wafers arrive in a discreet package. They are small, white, and taste slightly chalky. Clara is supposed to dissolve one on her tongue 3 times a day, like a mint. What she does not fully understand is that she is eating arsenic. Actual arsenic. The same substance used to poison rats and murder inconvenient people. At first, Clara notices positive effects. Her skin does seem to brighten slightly. Her eyes look a bit larger and more luminous, partly because arsenic causes mild fluid retention that makes the eyes appear wider. She feels validated in her choice and continues taking the wafers religiously 3 times a day every single day. After 3 months, Clara notices something strange. Her hands sometimes tingle. She has occasional episodes of nausea that she attributes to her corset being too tight. Her hair is falling out more than usual when she brushes it, but her skin does look paler, and that is what matters to her. That is what society tells her matters. After 6 months, Clara has developed a persistent cough. Her kidneys hurt, though she does not recognize the sensation. Strange, scaly patches have appeared on her arms, a condition called arsenical keratosis. Her nervous system is slowly being damaged. She is literally dying for beauty, and she has no idea. This was not a rare story. This happened to thousands upon thousands of Victorian women. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian beauty products. There were arsenic complexion wafers, arsenic-laced face powders, arsenic soaps, even arsenic creams. And because arsenic was not regulated, because companies could claim their products were safe without any proof, women had no way to protect themselves. The truly horrifying part is that arsenic is addictive, not in the psychological sense, but in a physiological way. As your body builds tolerance to arsenic, you need more of it to avoid withdrawal symptoms, so women would start with a small dose and gradually need more and more. Their bodies became dependent on poison. There are documented cases from regions of Bohemia in what is now the Czech Republic, where women would bathe in hot springs that contained high levels of arsenic. The famous actress and beauty writer Lola Montez wrote about this in her 1858 book, The Arts of Beauty. She described how these bohemian women achieved remarkably white skin through their arsenic baths, but warned that once they habituate themselves to the practice, they are obliged to keep it up the rest of their days, or death would speedily follow. Think about that. Women who stopped using arsenic after prolonged exposure would suffer severe withdrawal symptoms and could actually die from stopping. They were trapped by their pursuit of beauty, unable to stop poisoning themselves without risking death. But arsenic was not the only poison in Victorian makeup. Lead was perhaps even more common. Lead-based face paints and powders had been popular for centuries, and the Victorians continued the tradition. These white paints, sometimes called ceruse or spirits of Saturn, were applied to the face, neck, arms and chest, any skin that might be visible. The lead paint created a smooth porcelain-like surface that covered blemishes, scars and any imperfections. It gave the skin an unnaturally perfect appearance like a doll. But it came at a terrible cost. Lead is corrosive. It eats away at your skin. So women who used lead paint would develop sores, scars and discoloration. And how did they solve this problem? By applying more lead paint to cover the damage. It was a vicious cycle. The more you used, the more you needed, and the worse your skin became underneath the paint. Women who wore these lead-based paints also had to be very careful about their facial expressions. If they smiled too broadly or frowned or showed surprise, the paint would crack. Imagine going through your day trying not to show any emotion, because your face might literally crack like broken porcelain. The Victorian stereotype of women being unemotional and expressionless was not just about social expectations. It was partly about their makeup, and here is something that will make you uncomfortable. At the end of the day, these women had to remove the lead paint, but removing it was almost as damaging as wearing it. They would use harsh cleansers, often containing ammonia or other caustic chemicals, scrubbing at their faces to remove the day's coating of poison. This further damaged the skin, creating more problems that required more paint to cover. Mercury was another popular ingredient in Victorian cosmetics. It was used in products meant to lighten the skin, remove freckles, and promote eyelash and eyebrow growth. Women would apply mercury-based ointments to their faces nightly or around their eyes to encourage lash growth. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, tooth loss, kidney damage, and neurological problems. It can also cause personality changes, anxiety, and what was called Mad Hatter disease, because hat makers who used mercury in their work often went insane. Victorian women were literally putting this on their faces. A particularly disturbing beauty advice column from the 1870s, called the Ugly Girl Papers, was published in Harper's Bazaar. The author, Mrs. S.D. Powers, gave detailed beauty advice that included recommendations to coat the face with opium overnight for freshness, then wash it off in the morning with ammonia. She also suggested using mercury ointments to restore lost eyelashes. Can you imagine? A respected women's magazine publishing advice to put opium and mercury on your face. This was mainstream beauty guidance, not fringe pseudoscience. For women who wanted to make their eyes appear larger and more luminous, there was belladonna. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. When dropped into the eyes, it dilates the pupils, making the eyes appear huge, dark, and romantically dreamy. But belladonna causes blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and with repeated use, permanent eye damage and blindness. Women knew this, doctors warned about it, but the effect was so desirable that many women used it anyway, especially before important social events where they wanted to look their most alluring. For women who could not afford belladonna or did not want to risk blindness, there was a cheaper alternative: squeezing lemon juice or orange juice directly into their eyes. This would cause the eyes to water and redden, giving a dewy emotional appearance that was considered attractive. It also hurt tremendously, but beauty required sacrifice. The Victorian beauty industry was completely unregulated. Anyone could manufacture and sell beauty products with any ingredients they wanted, making any claims they wanted, with no oversight whatsoever. This led to some truly nightmarish products reaching the market. There were skin lightening creams that contained both arsenic and mercury. There were rouge products for the cheeks and lips that used mercury sulfide, which gave a beautiful red colour but slowly poisoned the user. There were hair dyes containing lead that could cause lead poisoning through the scalp. And because all of this was so secretive, because respectable women were supposed to be naturally beautiful and not admit to using cosmetics, women bought these products through the mail or through back doors of pharmacies, never discussing them openly. This secrecy meant they could not warn each other about dangerous products or share information about safer alternatives. The Victorian beauty ideal also included the look of consumption or tuberculosis. Yes, you read that correctly. The wasted, ethereal appearance of someone dying from tuberculosis was considered the height of beauty. Watery eyes, pale translucent skin, a slight flush on the cheeks, red lips. These were the symptoms of a fatal disease that killed millions, and they were romanticized and pursued as beauty goals. Some women, unbelievably, would intentionally expose themselves to tuberculosis to achieve this look. They would visit tuberculosis sanatoriums, share items with patients, even deliberately inhale air that tuberculosis patients had exhaled. This was not common, but it happened. Women literally risked a slow, suffocating death for beauty. Now you might be wondering, did Victorian women not know these products were dangerous? Did no one warn them? The truth is complicated. Some knew and did not care. Beauty was that important. Social pressure was that strong. Others genuinely did not know because the science of toxicology was still developing and companies lied in their advertising. But many women occupied a middle ground. They knew the products might be dangerous but believed the risk was worth it. They heard rumours of women suffering from lead poisoning or arsenic addiction, but convinced themselves it would not happen to them. They believed that using the products moderately would keep them safe, not understanding that no amount of daily arsenic consumption is moderate. There were also doctors and reformers who tried to sound the alarm. As early as the 1860s, medical journals were publishing articles about the dangers of arsenic complexion wafers and lead-based cosmetics. But these warnings competed with slick advertising and tremendous social pressure, and often the warnings lost. An 1869 medical text explicitly states, "The habitual use of arsenic preparations, while they may temporarily improve the complexion, lead to serious constitutional effects including damage to the kidneys, liver and nervous system, hair loss, and in severe cases, death." But women continued buying and using these products by the thousands. The long-term health effects on Victorian women who used these cosmetics regularly were devastating. Many developed chronic illnesses that they and their doctors did not connect to their beauty routines. Kidney failure, liver disease, neurological disorders, blindness, hair loss, skin conditions that never healed. There are tragic stories of young women who became invalids in their 20s and 30s, their health destroyed by years of arsenic wafers and lead paint and mercury creams. Their families often had no idea what had caused their decline. The women themselves might not have made the connection, attributing their illness to the vague Victorian diagnosis of female weakness or nervous exhaustion. And here is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of all this. These women were not foolish. They were not ignorant. They were responding rationally to the society they lived in. In Victorian society, a woman's beauty was her currency, her power, her ticket to a good marriage and a secure future. An unmarried woman with no beauty had very few options, so women took risks with their health because the alternative, being unmarried, poor and socially marginal, seemed worse. The pressure on Victorian women to be beautiful was immense and unrelenting. Every women's magazine, every beauty manual, every social interaction reinforced the idea that a woman's worth was tied to her appearance. And the beauty standard was so specific, so unnatural, so difficult to achieve naturally that many women felt they had no choice but to use these dangerous products. By the early 20th century, as medical science advanced and government regulations began to develop, these poisonous cosmetics gradually disappeared from the market. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States began to regulate what could be sold, and products had to list their ingredients. Arsenic complexion wafers became illegal. Lead-based paints were banned from cosmetics. But the damage had been done to generations of women who had sacrificed their health, their well-being, and sometimes their lives in pursuit of an impossible beauty standard. Victorian cemeteries hold countless young women who were killed by their own face powder and complexion wafers. When I think about Clara, my fictional Victorian woman slowly poisoning herself with arsenic wafers, I think about how little has changed in some ways. Women today still face immense pressure to meet beauty standards. We still use products with questionable ingredients. We still sometimes prioritize appearance over health. But at least today we have regulations, ingredient lists, warnings, and choices. Victorian women had none of these protections. They were at the mercy of unscrupulous manufacturers and a society that valued their beauty above their well-being. Of course, the poisonous cosmetics were not the only way Victorian women sacrificed their health for beauty. Because we have not yet talked about the garment that shaped the Victorian female silhouette, the piece of clothing that women wore from their teenage years until old age, the undergarment that quite literally reshaped their internal organs and restricted their ability to breathe. We need to discuss the corset and what it really did to Victorian women's bodies. The corset is perhaps the most iconic piece of Victorian clothing, and also the most misunderstood. When most people think of Victorian corsets, they picture women fainting dramatically, unable to breathe, their internal organs crushed into unnatural positions. And while there is some truth to this image, the reality is both more nuanced and somehow even more disturbing than the stereotype suggests. Let me start by being clear about something. Not all Victorian women tight-laced their corsets to extremes. Many wore them at reasonable sizes that provided support without serious health consequences. But many others, particularly young, fashion-conscious women desperate to achieve the ideal silhouette, absolutely did compress their bodies to dangerous degrees. And even moderate corset wearing, done every single day from adolescence through old age, had significant effects on the body. The Victorian ideal was the hourglass figure, but taken to an extreme we can barely comprehend today. An 18-inch waist was considered perfection. 20 inches was acceptable. Anything above 22 inches was considered large. Now, think about your own waist for a moment. The average adult woman's natural waist today is around 30 to 32 inches. Victorian women were trying to compress their waist to more than 10 inches smaller than what is naturally typical. How did they achieve this? Through a process that began in childhood and continued relentlessly throughout their lives. Let me walk you through what happened to a Victorian girl's body as she grew up wearing corsets. At around age 12 or 13, a girl would be put into her first corset. This was often presented as a rite of passage, a sign that she was becoming a young lady. Her mother and aunts would gather around, helping her into the stiff garment made of heavy fabric reinforced with steel or whalebone stays. They would pull the laces, gradually tightening them, and the girl would feel her torso being compressed, her ribs pushed in, her waist cinched. At first, it would be uncomfortable but not unbearable. The corset would be laced to a size that was smaller than her natural waist, but not dramatically so. But here is the crucial part. She would wear it every single day, all day, from the moment she dressed in the morning until she prepared for bed at night. Her body would never get a chance to return to its natural shape except for a few hours of sleep. Over months and years, the constant pressure would begin to reshape her rib cage. The lower ribs, which are naturally somewhat flexible, would gradually compress and curve inward. Her waist muscles would atrophy from lack of use because the corset was doing all the work of holding her torso upright. Her internal organs would shift position, accommodating the external pressure, and as her body adapted, the corsets would be tightened further. A 16-year-old girl who started at a 24-inch waist at age 12 might now be down to 20 inches, and still the pressure would continue. Mothers would often do the lacing, pulling tighter and tighter while their daughters gasped and protested. It was seen as necessary, as an act of love preparing the girl for marriage and society. By the time a Victorian woman reached her early 20s, her body had been permanently altered. X-rays of Victorian-era skeletons show dramatic deformations. The rib cage is compressed, sometimes with the lower ribs overlapping each other, or curved so severely that they nearly touch the pelvis. The spine shows abnormal curvature. The space where the internal organs should sit has been reduced by as much as 30%. Think about what this means for the organs themselves. The liver, which normally sits in a specific position in the upper right abdomen, would be pushed downward and compressed. The stomach would be squeezed into a smaller space, limiting how much food a woman could comfortably eat. The intestines would be compressed, leading to chronic constipation and digestive issues that plagued Victorian women throughout their lives. Most significantly, the lungs could not fully expand. A tightly corseted woman could only take shallow breaths using the upper part of her lungs. This is why Victorian women were always swooning and fainting. It was not because they were delicate flowers, it was because they literally could not get enough oxygen to their brains. Imagine trying to go about your daily life while only being able to take half breaths. Imagine climbing stairs while your lungs cannot fully expand. Imagine any kind of physical exertion while effectively suffocating. Victorian women were in a constant state of mild oxygen deprivation, and this had profound effects on their health and behaviour. The fainting was real and frequent. A woman might faint from standing too long because her compressed organs could not maintain proper blood flow. She might faint from excitement or fear because her restricted breathing could not supply enough oxygen during moments of stress. She might faint from climbing a single flight of stairs. Fainting couches and smelling salts were not just decorative accessories, they were medical necessities. But here is something that will surprise you. Many Victorian women genuinely believed that wearing corsets was healthy. Medical authorities of the time argued that women's bodies were weak and needed the external support that corsets provided. Doctors claim that without corsets, a woman's organs would sag and shift, causing illness. Women were told that the corset prevented back pain, improved posture, and supported the weak female constitution. So women wore their corsets believing they were protecting their health, not realizing that the corsets themselves were causing the very weakness and health problems that doctors attributed to the female body. It was a perfect circular trap. Pregnancy presented particular horrors. Victorian women were expected to remain tightly corseted even while pregnant, at least until it became physically impossible to lace the corset at all. Special maternity corsets were designed with extra panels that could expand somewhat, but the compression remained significant. This meant that pregnant women were compressing their growing wombs, restricting blood flow to the developing baby, limiting their own ability to breathe at a time when they needed more oxygen, not less. The rate of miscarriage, stillbirth, and maternal death during the Victorian era was horrifyingly high. and while many factors contributed to this, the corset certainly played a role. There are documented cases of Victorian women going into labour while still wearing their corsets because they were too embarrassed to be seen uncorseted, even by doctors and midwives. Some women would only loosen their corsets during the actual delivery, then lace them right back up afterward. The physical trauma this caused is almost unimaginable. After giving birth, women were expected to return to their pre-pregnancy waist size as quickly as possible. They would lace their corsets even tighter, trying to force their stretched and weakened abdominal muscles back into shape. This led to serious complications including organ prolapse, hernias, and chronic pain. Victorian women also slept in corsets, or at least in something called a night corset, which was slightly less restrictive but still provided compression. The idea that the body needed constant external support was so ingrained that allowing it to rest naturally seemed dangerous. Now, let us talk about the social pressure that made all of this seem not just acceptable but necessary. A woman with a naturally thick waist was considered unfashionable, undesirable, even morally suspect. It was believed that women who did not or could not achieve the tiny waist were lazy, gluttonous, or lacking in self-control. The size of your waist was seen as a reflection of your character. Young women would compare waist measurements the way we might compare dress sizes today, but with even more judgment and competition. A girl who could boast an 18-inch waist had social status. A girl with a 23-inch waist was pitied or scorned. This created intense pressure to tight lace to the most extreme degree possible. There are heartbreaking accounts from Victorian diaries of young women describing their struggles with corsets. One woman wrote in 1867, "Mamma laced me again today and I could scarcely breathe. When I complained, she said that suffering is the price of beauty and that I must bear it if I am ever to marry well. I felt faint all through dinner and could eat almost nothing. I do not know how much longer I can endure this." The could eat almost nothing part is particularly significant. Victorian women ate remarkably little, and while some of this was due to restricted diets, much of it was because their compressed stomachs simply could not hold normal amounts of food. A corseted woman would feel full after a few bites, and eating too much could cause severe pain as the stomach pushed against the unyielding corset. This led to a perverse situation where the ideal Victorian woman, pale, thin, weak, eating like a bird, was not a natural state, but rather the direct result of systematic physical damage caused by fashion. The swooning, the delicacy, the inability to exert herself, these were symptoms of semi-starvation and oxygen deprivation, not inherent feminine traits. The corset also caused skin problems. The constant pressure and friction led to bruising, welts, and sores where the corset pressed hardest against the body. The fabric would rub against skin that never fully healed because the corset was put back on every single day. Some women developed permanent indentations in their flesh where the corset bones had pressed for years. In summer, the situation was even worse. Imagine wearing a thick, tight garment made of heavy fabric and steel boning in the heat and humidity. Victorian women would sweat profusely underneath their corsets, but remember, they cannot bathe frequently and they never wash their outer clothes. The corset itself would absorb sweat day after day, becoming a damp, smelly prison that contributed to skin infections and rashes. There were occasional reform movements that tried to convince women to give up corsets. Dress reformers in the 1850s and again in the 1890s advocated for rational dress that allowed the body to move and breathe naturally. But these reformers were widely mocked. Women who appeared in public without corsets were considered scandalous, unfashionable, and morally questionable. The social pressure to conform was simply too strong. Some women did rebel quietly in the privacy of their own homes. There are accounts of women removing their corsets the moment they were alone. gasping in relief as their bodies expanded back toward their natural shape. But they would lace back up before anyone saw them, maintaining the fiction of the perfect hourglass figure. The long-term health consequences of a lifetime of corset wearing were severe. Victorian women suffered from chronic back pain because their atrophied muscles could no longer support their spine without the corset. They had digestive problems that persisted even after they stopped corseting. They had difficulty breathing even when the corset was removed. Their bodies had been so profoundly altered that they could never fully return to normal. There are also accounts of sudden corset-related deaths. A woman would be going about her day, her corset laced as always, when suddenly she would collapse and die. Autopsies sometimes revealed that the tight lacing had caused internal injuries, a perforated organ, internal bleeding, or sudden heart failure caused by the compression. One particularly well-documented case from 1885 involved a 23-year-old woman who died suddenly at a ball. The autopsy revealed that her liver had been pierced by one of her own ribs, which had been deformed by years of tight lacing. The rib had slowly pressed against the liver until it finally punctured it, and she bled to death internally while dancing. Yet despite knowing these dangers, despite the pain and the fainting and the health problems, Victorian women continued to wear corsets. Because the alternative, being seen as unfashionable, being unable to wear the beautiful clothes of the era, being considered unmarriageable, seemed worse than the physical suffering. By the early 20th century, fashion began to change. The rigid Victorian corset gave way to less restrictive undergarments. Women began to participate in sports and physical activities that were impossible while corseted. The ideal body shape shifted away from the extreme hourglass. But for the women who had spent their entire lives in corsets, the damage was permanent. Their bodies bore the marks of their suffering forever. When I think about Victorian corsets, I'm struck by how women's bodies were treated as something to be moulded, shaped, and controlled rather than respected and cared for. The corset is a perfect metaphor for how Victorian society treated women. Compressed, restricted, shaped into an ideal that served social expectations rather than the woman's own well-being. But as terrible as the corset was for women's overall health, it was not the only aspect of daily hygiene that we would find shocking. Because we have not yet addressed what Victorian women did about dental care, or rather, what they did not do. And I have to warn you, when you learn about Victorian dental hygiene, you might never complain about going to the dentist again. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are at a formal dinner party in Victorian London, 1878. The room is elegant, the conversation refined, the women beautiful in their silk gowns. But as you look around the table, you notice something unsettling. Nearly every adult in the room is missing teeth. Not just one or two, but multiple gaps in their smiles. Some of the older guests have almost no teeth at all, and the teeth that remain are often brown, black, or visibly decayed. This was normal, this was expected, because dental hygiene in the Victorian era was, to put it mildly, absolutely horrifying. Now, before we dive into the disturbing details, I want you to think about your own dental routine. You probably brush your teeth twice a day with a soft-bristled toothbrush and fluoride toothpaste. You might floss. You visit the dentist twice a year for cleanings and checkups. You have access to fillings, root canals, crowns, all sorts of treatments to save damaged teeth. This is so normal to us that we barely think about it. Victorian women had none of this, none of it, and the state of their teeth and mouths reflected this lack in ways that are genuinely difficult to stomach. Let me take you into the morning routine of a typical Victorian woman and show you what passed for dental care. Her name is Elizabeth. She is 32 years old and she lives in a comfortable middle-class home in Boston. When Elizabeth wakes up and prepares for the day, her approach to dental hygiene is very different from ours. She does not have a toothbrush. Well, toothbrushes existed. They were invented in their modern form around 1857, but they were expensive and many people, including Elizabeth, did not own one. Instead, she uses her finger. She dips her index finger into a small dish of salt, and she rubs this salt across her teeth and gums. Just salt. No paste, no foam, no mint flavour, just coarse salt crystals scrubbed across the enamel. This does remove some surface debris, and salt does have mild antiseptic properties, but it is also abrasive, slowly wearing down the enamel with each use, and it does absolutely nothing to clean between the teeth or address the bacteria that cause decay. Elizabeth performs this routine once a day in the morning. Sometimes she might do it again before bed, but often she does not. The idea of brushing after every meal would seem absurdly excessive to her. Once a day is considered quite conscientious, but Elizabeth is actually doing better than many of her contemporaries. Some Victorian women used even cruder methods. In rural areas, it was common to use a frayed twig as a makeshift toothbrush. You would take a small stick, chew one end until the fibres separated and became brush-like, then use this to scrub your teeth. It was free and readily available, which made it popular among the working class and poor. Can you imagine sticking a piece of wood in your mouth and using it to clean your teeth? The splinters alone would be agonizing, not to mention the complete lack of any actual cleaning power. For those who could afford something more sophisticated, there were tooth powders. These homemade or commercially available powders were mixed with water to form a paste, then applied to the teeth with a finger or cloth. But the ingredients in these powders were often more harmful than helpful. Some tooth powder recipes included charcoal, which is actually not terrible. Activated charcoal is still used in some natural toothpastes today. But other recipes included things like crushed brick, ground cuttlefish bone, or pumice stone. These were extremely abrasive and would literally grind away the tooth enamel over time, making the teeth more vulnerable to decay. And then there were the truly bizarre and disturbing ingredients. Some Victorian tooth powders contained cocaine. Yes, actual cocaine. It was added because cocaine numbs the gums, which people mistakenly interpreted as a therapeutic effect. A woman might mix up her tooth powder, add a drop or two of cocaine as the recipe instructed, and use this to clean her teeth daily, slowly becoming addicted without understanding why she felt she needed to use this particular powder. Other powders contained acids meant to whiten the teeth. These would indeed remove stains temporarily, but they would also eat away at the enamel, causing far more damage than any staining ever could. By the 1870s, commercial toothpaste began to appear. Colgate started manufacturing toothpaste in jars in 1873, but even this early toothpaste was harsh and abrasive by modern standards. It was soap-based, which meant it tasted terrible and could cause irritation, and it would be another 60 years before the nylon bristle toothbrush was invented in 1938, making brushing more effective and widespread. But here is the bigger problem. Even if Elizabeth used the best tooth cleaning methods available in her time, it would not save her teeth, because the Victorian diet was destroying them from the inside. Refined sugar became increasingly available and affordable during the Victorian era. Where previous generations had used honey or maple syrup as occasional sweeteners, Victorians had access to white sugar, which they used abundantly, tea with multiple spoonfuls of sugar, cakes and pêtries, candied fruits, sweet preserves. The Victorian sweet tooth was legendary, and this sugar was causing cavities at a rate that tooth-cleaning methods, no matter how diligent, could not prevent. The bacteria in the mouth feed on sugar and produce acid, which eats away at tooth enamel. Without fluoride in the water or toothpaste, without effective brushing techniques, without any real understanding of dental hygiene, Victorian teeth did not stand a chance. By the time Elizabeth reaches her 30s, she's already lost 3 teeth. not from injury or accident, but simply from decay. One day a tooth would start to hurt. The pain would increase over days or weeks until it became unbearable. And then Elizabeth would have to make a terrible choice. She could try to endure the pain. Many Victorian women did this, suffering through toothaches that could last for months. They would use laudanum or other opium-based painkillers to dull the agony, but the underlying problem would only worsen, or she could have the tooth pulled. And this brings us to perhaps the most nightmarish aspect of Victorian dental care: the complete lack of proper dentistry. In many areas there were no dentists. The person who pulled teeth might be the local barber, the blacksmith, or a travelling tooth puller who went from town to town with a set of forceps and no medical training whatsoever. These individuals had no anaesthetic to offer, no pain relief, just brute force. Picture this scene. Elizabeth, in agony from an abscessed molar, goes to see the barber. He has her sit in his chair, has someone hold her head still, and then he takes his tooth-pulling pliers, grips the rotten tooth and yanks. Elizabeth screams. Blood fills her mouth. The pain is indescribable. Sometimes the tooth comes out in one piece. Sometimes it shatters, and the barber has to dig out the fragments with his unwashed hands and crude tools. There is no stitching, no antibiotics, just a bleeding hole in Elizabeth's jaw that will take weeks to heal, if it heals properly at all. Many tooth extractions led to serious infections that could spread to the jawbone or even to the brain, causing death. Even when trained dentists did exist, their abilities were extremely limited. They could extract teeth, yes, but fillings were crude, made of lead, gold amalgam, or tinfoil pressed into the cavity. Root canals were primitive and agonizing. Any complex procedure was performed without effective anesthesia. Anesthesia in dentistry did not become common until late in the Victorian era. Before that, the best you might get was a shot of whiskey to dull the pain, or perhaps some cocaine rubbed on the gums. Most dental work was performed on fully conscious, fully feeling patients who were simply expected to endure the agony. This meant that many Victorian women avoided the dentist at all costs, even when they desperately needed treatment. They would let teeth rot in their mouths rather than face the horror of extraction. They would suffer with abscesses and infections, and their overall health suffered as a result. We now know that poor dental health contributes to heart disease, systemic infections, and numerous other health problems. Victorian women with mouths full of rotten teeth were experiencing constant low-level infections that taxed their immune systems and contributed to their general poor health. By the time a Victorian woman reached her 40s or 50s, having lost most or all of her teeth was completely normal. And this is where we get to another disturbing aspect of Victorian life: false teeth. Dentures existed, but they were expensive, uncomfortable, and often made from disturbing materials. The best false teeth were made from ivory carved to look like natural teeth. But ivory was costly and not everyone could afford it. Cheaper dentures might be made from animal teeth, horse teeth or sheep teeth carved and shaped to fit a human mouth. These were functional but obviously looked strange, and they wore down quickly. And then there was the most disturbing source of false teeth: human teeth, real teeth pulled from the mouths of corpses, particularly young soldiers killed in battle. After major battles, there were individuals who would go among the dead and pull out their teeth to sell to dentists. These were called Waterloo teeth after the famous battle, and they were considered high quality because they came from young, healthy people. Think about this. A wealthy Victorian woman who had lost her teeth might be wearing dentures made from teeth extracted from dead soldiers on a battlefield. The teeth of a 20-year-old man who died violently were now sitting in the mouth of a 45-year-old society lady. This actually happened. This was a real industry. The dentures themselves were held in place by springs or wires, which was uncomfortable and unreliable. They would slip while eating or talking, causing embarrassment. They had to be removed at night and cleaned, and they often caused sores and irritation in the mouth. Many Victorian women simply gave up on false teeth altogether. They would live the rest of their lives unable to eat many foods, speaking with a lisp or mumble, their faces collapsing inward from the lack of teeth to support the structure. The sunken cheeks and the puckered mouths we associate with old age in Victorian photographs are often the result of complete tooth loss by middle age. The psychological impact of losing your teeth was profound. In a society that valued appearance so highly, a gap-toothed smile or complete tooth loss was deeply shameful. Women would learn to smile with their mouths closed, or to hide their mouths behind fans or their hands when they spoke. The shame and self-consciousness was constant. There are heartbreaking diary entries from Victorian women lamenting their lost teeth. One woman wrote in 1883, "Another tooth has gone. I look in the mirror and hardly recognise myself. I'm only 37, yet my mouth looks like that of a crone. How can I bear to be seen in society like this?" And remember, all of this tooth loss and decay was happening while these women were also dealing with everything else we have discussed. The infrequent bathing, the unwashed hair, the poisonous cosmetics, the corsets that prevented proper breathing. Add to this a mouthful of rotting teeth and missing teeth, and you begin to understand that the reality of Victorian womanhood was far from the romantic image we often have. The Victorian era also had some truly strange beliefs about teeth and health. Some medical texts claimed that tooth decay was caused by bad humours in the body rather than bacteria and sugar. Others believed that tooth loss was an inevitable part of aging, especially for women, and that attempting to prevent it was futile. There was also a belief that pregnancy caused tooth loss, with the saying "gain a child, lose a tooth." This was partly true, but not for the mystical reasons Victorians believed. Pregnancy does affect dental health because the developing baby needs calcium, and if the mother is deficient, her body will take calcium from her teeth. But Victorian women, who were often poorly nourished and had limited access to calcium-rich foods, were especially vulnerable. Combined with their existing poor dental hygiene, pregnancy often did result in significant tooth loss. Some women had all their teeth pulled in their 20s or 30s, even healthy ones, and replaced with dentures. This might seem extreme, but they reasoned that it was better to get it over with while you could afford good dentures, rather than lose them gradually and painfully over time. Imagine making the decision to have all your teeth removed while they are still functional, just to avoid the inevitable decay and pain that everyone expected. The social implications of dental health were significant. A woman with good teeth into her older years was considered unusually blessed. A young woman with all her teeth was more marriageable. Toothlessness at 40 was common enough not to be shocking, but it was still undesirable in aging. This created yet another pressure on Victorian women. Not only did they need to maintain their figures, their complexions, their hair, they also needed to preserve their teeth for as long as possible. But they had no real tools to do so. They were fighting a losing battle against sugar, poor hygiene techniques, and the complete lack of modern dental care. By the late Victorian era and into the Edwardian period, dental care did begin to improve. Better techniques emerged. Anesthesia became more common. The science of dentistry advanced. But for the women who lived through most of the Victorian era, dental health was simply one more area where they suffered unnecessarily. When I think about Victorian dental hygiene, the salts and twigs and cocaine powders, the tooth pullers with no training and no anesthesia, the dentures made from battlefield corpses, the shame of a gap-toothed smile, I am grateful for modern dentistry in a way I never was before. Yes, dental visits can be uncomfortable, but they are nothing compared to what Victorian women endured. Of course, bad teeth were not the only problem Victorian women had with their appearance beyond their control. Because we have not yet discussed what happened to the clothes themselves, the beautiful silk gowns and elegant dresses that these women wore day after day after day, often without ever washing them. And what I am about to tell you about Victorian laundry practices, or rather the lack thereof, is going to change how you view those gorgeous museum costumes forever. When you look at preserved Victorian dresses in museums, they are breathtaking. The intricate beadwork, the delicate lace, the rich velvets and silks, they seem like works of art. And they are beautiful, truly beautiful. But there is something those museum displays cannot convey, something that has been lost to time but would have been immediately obvious to anyone who lived in that era: the smell. Because those gorgeous dresses, those elaborate gowns that Victorian women wore to balls and dinner parties and social calls, they were almost never washed. Not rarely washed, not infrequently washed, never washed. From the day a dress was made until the day it fell apart or went out of style, it would likely never be fully cleaned. And I need you to really think about what this means. A woman would wear the same dress repeatedly, perhaps dozens of times over months or even years. She would sweat in it, spill food on it, sit in dusty carriages, walk through dirty streets where horse manure and garbage littered the ground, attend events in smoky rooms lit by gas lamps and candles, and through all of this, the dress would never be washed. Let me introduce you to Catherine, a middle-class Victorian woman living in Philadelphia in 1885. She owns 3 good dresses for social occasions, one in deep burgundy silk, one in navy blue wool, and one in emerald green taffeta. These dresses are expensive, representing a significant investment for her family. Each one took weeks for a dressmaker to create, with careful attention to every seam and decoration. Catherine wears her burgundy dress to a dinner party on a warm evening in June. The dining room is hot, lit by candles and a small fireplace. She is wearing her corset laced tightly, and underneath a heavy silk dress, she is perspiring. Sweat trickles down her back, dampens her armpits, moistens her chest. The dress absorbs it all. During dinner, she accidentally drops a small piece of beef in her lap. She quickly brushes it away, but a faint grease stain remains on the silk. Later, as she sits in the parlour, some ash from the fireplace drifts onto her skirt. When she stands to leave, she realises she's been sitting on something, perhaps a small smudge of dirt from the chair cushion, and now there is a mark on the back of her dress. When Catherine arrives home that night, she does not wash the dress. She does not even consider it. Instead, she hangs it carefully in her wardrobe to air out. The next morning, she takes a stiff brush and brushes the dress vigorously, working from top to bottom, trying to remove any visible dirt or dust. She holds it up to the light, examining the grease stain. She takes a clean cloth dampened with a tiny bit of benzene, a cleaning solvent, and carefully dabs at the stain until it is less visible. And that is it. That is the extent of the cleaning. The sweat that soaked into the underarm area, still there, dried into the fabric. The microscopic particles of food, ash, and street dirt that worked their way into the fibres, still there. The oils from her skin that transferred everywhere the fabric touched her body, still there. Catherine will wear this dress again in 2 weeks, and again a month after that, and each time the same process. Brush it, spot clean any visible stains, air it out and put it back in the wardrobe. The dress is never submerged in water, never truly cleaned. It just accumulates more and more layers of dirt, sweat, oils, and odours. Now, you might be wondering why. Why would Victorian women not wash their dresses? There were several reasons, all of them rooted in the realities of 19th century life. First, washing would destroy most Victorian fabrics. Silk, which was extremely popular, is water sensitive. Immersing a silk dress in water would cause the colours to run, the fabric to shrink and distort, and the delicate structure to fall apart. Velvet, another favoured fabric, would be ruined by washing. The pile would crush and mat, never to recover. Even sturdy wools could shrink dramatically or lose their shape. The dyes used in Victorian fabrics were not colour-fast like modern dyes. They were natural or chemical dyes that would bleed and fade when wet. A beautiful deep blue dress could emerge from washing streaky, pale and ruined. And remember, these dresses were expensive. A working-class woman might own only 2 or 3 dresses total. Middle-class woman might have 5 or 6. Ruining a dress by washing it was not an option. Second, the construction of Victorian dresses made washing nearly impossible. These were not simple garments. They had boning, padding, horsehair crinolines, multiple layers, intricate trims, and decorations that were sewn on. Many had structured bodices that were essentially built, not just sewn. Submerging all of this in water would cause the internal structures to collapse, the decorations to fall off, and the whole dress to be destroyed. Third, washing a dress, really washing it properly, was an enormous undertaking in the Victorian era. Remember, there were no washing machines. Everything was done by hand. Washing a large, heavy dress would require filling a tub with water, heating that water, scrubbing the fabric, rinsing it multiple times, wringing it out, and then hanging it to dry. This could take an entire day or more, and at the end of it, the dress would probably be ruined anyway. So Victorian women developed an entire system of clothing maintenance that relied on everything except washing. They brushed, they spot cleaned, they aired garments out, they used dress shields to protect the underarms from sweat, and they simply accepted that their outer garments would never be truly clean. But here is something important. While outer garments were never washed, undergarments were. This is crucial to understanding Victorian hygiene. A woman would wear a chemise, a thin white cotton garment, next to her skin, under her corset. This chemise absorbed most of the sweat and body oils, and this garment was washed regularly, perhaps weekly. The white cotton could withstand hot water and harsh soap. It could be boiled to sterilize it and bleach out stains. This was why white undergarments were such a status symbol. Being able to keep your chems and petticoats pristine white proved that you had the resources, the time, the servants, the soap to wash them frequently. So the Victorian approach to clothing cleanliness was essentially this: keep the layer next to your skin clean, and hope that protects the expensive outer layers from getting too filthy. It was a system born of necessity, not preference. But we need to talk about what this actually meant for the cleanliness and smell of Victorian women. Because even with clean undergarments, the outer dresses were absorbing odours and dirt constantly. Think about your own clothes for a moment. How often do you wash your jeans? Maybe after 2 or 3 wears. Your jacket or coat, perhaps a few times a season. Now imagine wearing a heavy wool dress for an entire winter, wearing it dozens of times, and never washing it once. Imagine a silk evening gown worn to 10 different parties, absorbing perfume and smoke and sweat each time, never cleaned. The smell would have been noticeable, not necessarily overwhelming. Remember, Victorian perfumes were strong and designed partly to mask odours. And since everyone's clothes smelled similar, people's noses probably adjusted. But by modern standards, a room full of Victorian women in their never-washed dresses would have had a distinct and unpleasant odour. Victorian women were aware of this problem and tried various solutions. Some would sprinkle dried lavender or rose petals between layers of stored clothing to provide a pleasant scent. Others would hang dresses near open windows to air them out, hoping the fresh air would dissipate odours. Some would even hang dresses outside on cold winter nights, believing that the freezing temperature would kill odour-causing bacteria, which is actually somewhat effective, though they did not understand the science behind it. There were also professional cleaners who could attempt to clean dresses without washing them. Dry cleaning using solvents like benzene or turpentine was invented in France in the 1840s and gradually spread. But this was expensive and not always effective. The solvents themselves were toxic and could damage both the fabric and the person wearing it. Some women would take their most precious dresses apart entirely, unstitch all the seams, wash the pieces separately, and then have them resewn. This could sometimes work, but it was time-consuming and expensive. Most women only did this for wedding dresses or other extremely important garments. The class differences in clothing cleanliness were stark. Wealthy women could afford to have more dresses, meaning each individual dress was worn less frequently. They could afford to have servants brush and spot clean their garments daily. They could afford the occasional professional cleaning. And perhaps most importantly, they could afford to discard dresses that became too soiled or odorous and simply have new ones made. Working-class women had none of these advantages. A factory worker might own only 2 dresses, one for work and one for church. The work dress would be worn day after day, week after week, accumulating sweat, grime, and whatever substances she encountered at her job. It would be brushed occasionally, perhaps spot cleaned if possible, but otherwise simply worn until it literally fell apart. The dark colours popular in Victorian working-class clothing were not just a fashion choice. Dark fabrics, browns, greys, blacks, showed dirt less than light colours. A dark wool dress could be worn for months while visibly appearing relatively clean, even if it was actually quite filthy. There are accounts from Victorian workhouses and orphanages where poor women and girls wore the same dresses for years without washing. The fabric would become stiff with accumulated dirt and sweat almost standing up on its own. These women were not lazy or careless. They simply had no alternatives. No other clothes to wear while these were cleaned, no resources to wash them properly, no way to dry them quickly in cramped, damp living quarters. The health implications of never washing outer clothing were significant. Fabrics that are never cleaned become breeding grounds for bacteria, lice, and fleas. Skin irritations and infections were common, especially in areas where clothing rubbed against skin, underarms, waistbands, necklines. The combination of dirty clothes and infrequent bathing created ideal conditions for various skin diseases. There was also the issue of illness transmission. Diseases could be carried on clothing. A woman with tuberculosis who coughed into her sleeve would have those bacteria living in her dress fabric for weeks or months. Someone with any contagious skin condition could spread it through clothing that was never disinfected. The lack of washing meant that clothes were essentially disease vectors. Victorian etiquette manuals would occasionally address the clothing cleanliness issue, but always delicately. They would suggest brushing daily, airing garments, using dress shields, and changing undergarments frequently. But they would never come right out and say that outer garments should be washed, because everyone knew it was impractical or impossible. Some manuals suggested having your maid brush your dress thoroughly every single morning before you put it on, using a stiff brush and working in the fresh air if possible. This was supposed to remove surface dirt and refresh the fabric. But of course, this assumed you had a maid, which most women did not. By the 1890s and early 1900s, clothing began to change in ways that made washing more feasible. Simpler styles with less elaborate construction became popular. Fabrics improved with better dyes that could withstand water. Washing machines began to appear, though they were primitive and still required enormous amounts of manual labour. But for most of the Victorian era, washing a dress was simply not done. And this fundamental fact shaped so many other aspects of Victorian women's lives. It is why they wore so many layers, to protect the outer dress from direct contact with skin. It is why white undergarments were so important. They were the only part that could be properly cleaned. It is why dark colours were practical. They hid the inevitable accumulation of dirt. It is also why Victorian women were so obsessed with appearing delicate and avoiding physical exertion. A lady who did not sweat heavily would keep her dresses cleaner longer. A woman who did not move too vigorously would cause less wear and tear on fabrics that could not be washed. The ideal of the immobile, passive Victorian woman was partly about clothing preservation. When I think about this, about women wearing the same dress over and over, knowing it was accumulating layers of sweat and dirt and odor, having no way to truly clean it, just brushing and hoping and drowning it in perfume, I feel such sadness for them. They wanted to be beautiful, clean, presentable. But the limitations of their era made true cleanliness impossible. Those gorgeous museum dresses we admire had to have smelled terrible when they were being worn. The silk and velvet and lace that looks so pristine under glass was once saturated with human sweat, stained with food and drink, impregnated with smoke and dust and the general filth of 19th century urban life. Victorian women knew this. They lived with it daily. They did the best they could with brushing and spot cleaning and fresh undergarments, but they also knew that their beautiful clothes were, underneath the surface, quite disgusting by any objective measure. And speaking of things that were disgusting beneath a beautiful surface, we have not yet discussed one final aspect of Victorian women's hygiene that was perhaps the most intimate and misunderstood of all: the ways Victorian women cleaned themselves in their most private moments, the douching practices that were supposed to ensure freshness but actually caused tremendous harm. We need to discuss something that Victorian society absolutely refused to talk about publicly, yet millions of women practiced in secret. Something that was sold openly in catalogues and drugstores, advertised in coded language and considered essential to feminine hygiene. Something that modern medicine now recognizes as not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to women's health. I am talking about vaginal douching. And the story of how Victorian women cleaned their most intimate areas is a perfect example of how ignorance, shame, and commercial exploitation combined to cause tremendous suffering. In the Victorian era, the vagina was considered inherently dirty, something that needed constant cleaning and purification. This belief was so widespread, so deeply ingrained, that most women never questioned it. Of course you needed to douche regularly. Of course your natural body was unclean. Of course you needed special products and devices to make yourself acceptable. This is what society told women, and this is what women believed. Let me show you what this actually looked like in practice. Meet Harriet, a newly married woman in 1890. She is 22 years old and has recently moved into a small house with her husband in a suburb of Chicago. Her mother and aunts have taken her aside before the wedding and explained certain things, always in whispers, always with embarrassment, but they've explained. After intimate relations with her husband, Harriet is supposed to cleanse herself. This is presented as both a hygiene measure and a method of preventing pregnancy, though it is actually quite ineffective at the latter. Her mother has given her a vaginal syringe as a wedding gift. It is made of hard rubber, with a long nozzle and a bulb that holds the douching solution. The first time Harriet uses it, she is alone in her bedroom, following the instructions her mother gave her. She has mixed a solution of water with alum powder, a common ingredient in Victorian douching solutions that was supposed to have astringent and tightening properties. She fills the syringe bulb with this mixture. The process is uncomfortable and awkward. She must insert the nozzle while lying down or squatting, then squeeze the bulb to force the liquid inside her body. The sensation is strange, invasive, and the alum solution burns slightly. She does this every single time after intercourse, sometimes every few days even without intercourse, because she has been taught this is necessary for health and cleanliness. What Harriet does not know, what no one has told her, is that she is disrupting her body's natural pH balance, washing away beneficial bacteria, and creating conditions perfect for infections. She is solving a problem that does not exist while creating real health issues that will plague her for years. The Victorian douching industry was enormous. If you flip through a Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward catalogue from the 1890s, you will find multiple pages dedicated to feminine hygiene products. These catalogues, which were mailed to homes across America, openly advertised vaginal syringes in various styles and price points. There were bulb syringes made of hard rubber. There were bag and tube systems where you would hang a bag of solution and let gravity force it through a tube into your body. There were fountain syringes with long flexible tubes. Some were plain and functional. Others were decorated with embossed patterns, marketed as elegant and refined, as if prettying up a douching apparatus made the whole practice less invasive and uncomfortable. And the language in these advertisements is fascinating. They never used crude terms or explicit descriptions. Instead, they used euphemisms that everyone understood. For feminine hygiene, for married women's health, for post-marital cleansing. Everyone knew what these meant. The products sold in huge quantities, which tells us just how widespread the practice was. But it was not just the devices themselves. There was an entire industry of douching solutions and powders. Some were relatively benign, plain water with a bit of vinegar or baking soda, but others contained ingredients that were actively harmful. Alum was extremely popular. It is an aluminum compound that has astringent properties, meaning it causes tissues to contract and tighten. Victorian women believed this tightening effect was beneficial, that it restored virginity or youth, that it was cleansing. In reality, alum was irritating the delicate vaginal tissues, drying them out, and making infections more likely. Carbolic acid, yes, the same corrosive chemical used as a disinfectant, was sometimes recommended for douching. Can you imagine? Putting a substance that could burn skin into the most sensitive part of your body. Women did this believing they were ensuring cleanliness and health. Lysol, the household disinfectant that we now use to clean toilets, was actually marketed as a feminine hygiene product in the late Victorian and early 20th century. The advertisements were coded but clear, showing elegant women and promising marital happiness and feminine confidence. What they were really selling was Lysol douche, which women used after intercourse both for cleanliness and with the mistaken belief that it prevented pregnancy. Think about this. Lysol, inside your body, regularly. Women were burning and damaging their vaginal tissues with industrial disinfectant because society had convinced them their natural bodies were so unclean that such extreme measures were necessary. The belief that douching prevented pregnancy was widespread and completely false. After intercourse, women would douche with vinegar, with Lysol, with alum solutions, thinking they were washing away sperm and preventing conception. In reality, sperm swim too quickly for douching to have any effect. By the time a woman douched, even if she did so immediately, sperm had already travelled beyond the reach of any douching solution. But women had no access to reliable birth control information. Contraception was illegal to discuss or distribute in many places thanks to the Comstock laws, which classified contraceptive information as obscenity. So women relied on folk methods, on whispered advice from other women, on euphemistic advertisements that promised results without explicitly saying what those results were, and the douching manufacturers deliberately encouraged this confusion. They could not legally advertise their products as contraceptives, but they could use language that suggested it. For marital hygiene. For preventing problems. Women understood the subtext and bought the products in desperation. The result was countless unwanted pregnancies among women who thought they were protected, and countless vaginal infections, irritations, and long-term damage among women who douched regularly with harsh chemicals. The medical establishment of the Victorian era not only failed to warn women about the dangers of douching, many doctors actively recommended it. Medical texts from the 1880s and 1890s include detailed instructions for douching, with recipes for solutions and advice on frequency. Some doctors suggested douching daily. Others recommended it after intercourse, during menstruation, or other specific times. This medical endorsement gave douching legitimacy. If your doctor recommended it, surely it must be healthy and necessary. Women trusted their doctors, followed their advice, and suffered the consequences. But here is what makes this even more tragic. The vagina is self-cleaning. It maintains its own pH balance. It produces its own protective secretions. The natural bacteria that live there, the vaginal microbiome, are protective, not harmful. Everything that Victorian women were doing to clean themselves was actually destroying their body's natural defences and causing the very problems they were trying to prevent. Victorian women would douche to prevent infections, but the douching itself would disrupt their natural bacterial balance, making infections more likely. They would then douche more frequently to treat the infection, making it worse. It was a vicious cycle of intervention and harm, all based on the fundamental misconception that the female body was inherently dirty and needed constant correction. The shame and secrecy surrounding all of this made it worse. A woman could not talk openly about vaginal infections or discomfort. She could not compare experiences with friends or seek advice easily. She certainly could not discuss it with men, even her husband or doctor. So women suffered in isolation, never realizing that their symptoms were widespread, that they were caused by the very treatments they were using, that they were all harming themselves in the same ways. Victorian diaries occasionally reveal glimpses of this hidden suffering. A woman might write cryptically about female troubles or discomfort of a delicate nature. She might mention using Mrs. Parsons' special solution, or the treatment Dr. Brown recommended. These vague references were how women recorded their douching practices and the problems that followed, unable to be more explicit even in their private journals. There were also herbal douches and homemade solutions passed down from mothers to daughters. Some were relatively harmless. Chamomile tea, for instance, was popular and at least was not actively toxic, but others included pennyroyal, rue, or other herbs that were actually abortifacients, plants that could cause miscarriage. Women using these herbal douches might have been trying to cleanse themselves, or they might have been attempting to end pregnancies, or both. The line between hygiene and birth control and abortion was blurred and deliberately kept unclear. The class differences in douching practices were significant. Wealthy women could afford the commercially produced syringes and solutions. They might even have bidets, a European innovation that allowed for external cleansing and was considered the height of luxury. Middle-class women bought the catalogue products or made their own solutions following recipes from women's magazines. Poor women had to improvise with whatever was available. They might use makeshift syringes made from household items. They might use harsh soap and water, which was free but damaging. Or they might douche irregularly or not at all simply because they lacked the resources, and then they would be judged as unclean, as failing in their feminine duties. The entire douching industry was built on making women feel inadequate, dirty, and in constant need of products to fix problems that did not actually exist. This is not so different from some modern feminine hygiene marketing, is it? The message that women's natural bodies need special products, that natural scents are shameful, that constant intervention is necessary, these ideas have deep Victorian roots. By the early 20th century, some doctors began to question the practice of douching. Medical understanding of infections, bacteria, and vaginal health improved. But douching remained common well into the mid-1900s. My own grandmother, born in 1920, was taught to douche regularly. It has only been in the last few decades that the medical consensus has clearly stated that douching is unnecessary and harmful. Modern gynecologists are unanimous. The vagina does not need douching. In fact, douching washes away protective bacteria, alters pH balance, and increases the risk of infections, pelvic inflammatory disease, and other complications. The Victorian women who suffered through burning alum solutions and caustic Lysol douches were harming themselves for absolutely no benefit. When I think about Harriet, dutifully douching with her burning alum solution after every intimate encounter, never questioning that this discomfort was necessary, never knowing that her recurring infections were caused by the very treatment she used to prevent them, I feel such frustration. She was doing exactly what society told her to do. She was being a good, clean, proper woman, and she was paying for it with chronic pain and illness. This is the insidious nature of beauty and hygiene standards that are based not on health but on shame and profit. Victorian women were taught that their natural bodies were wrong, dirty, and in need of constant correction. They were sold products to fix problems that did not exist. They were isolated by shame from sharing information that could have helped them. And they suffered, generation after generation, because no one questioned the fundamental assumption that women's bodies needed fixing. The douching story is in many ways the perfect encapsulation of everything we have discussed about Victorian women's hygiene. The disconnect between appearance and reality, the suffering hidden behind propriety, the commercial exploitation of shame, the terrible advice given by the medical establishment, the isolation caused by the inability to discuss intimate matters openly, the way women's health was sacrificed to social expectations. But there is one more aspect of Victorian women's appearance that we have not fully explored. One more shocking practice that was literally poisonous to everyone around them, not just to themselves. Because those beautiful Victorian dresses were not just never washed, some of them were actively deadly, dyed with arsenic compounds that could kill everyone from the wearer to the dressmaker to the guests at the party where the dress was worn. Fashion has always had its dangers, but nothing in history compares to the Victorian obsession with a single colour that was quite literally killing people. A colour so beautiful, so vibrant, so fashionable, that women would wear it despite knowing it might be the death of them. I am talking about emerald green, specifically a shade called Sheila's green or Paris green, and the story of how this colour poisoned an entire generation is almost too horrifying to believe. Imagine walking into a Victorian ballroom in 1862. The room is magnificent, decorated with elaborate floral arrangements made of artificial flowers. The wallpaper is a stunning emerald green with gold accents. The curtains are a rich, deep green velvet. And the women are wearing the most beautiful green gowns you have ever seen. Emerald silk that shimmers in the candlelight. Green taffeta that rustles with every movement. Delicate green lace overlaying pale satin. It is breathtaking. It is the height of fashion. And it is a death trap. Because that beautiful green colour, that perfect, vibrant emerald that everyone wants, is achieved by mixing copper with arsenic trioxide, also known as white arsenic, the same substance used to poison rats, the same substance that has murdered countless people throughout history. And it is in the dresses, the wallpaper, the artificial flowers, the children's toys, the book covers, even in the candles and the fake holly decorations at Christmas. Let me tell you about Matilda Scheurer. She was 19 years old, working in a London factory in 1861 making artificial flowers. Her job was to dust green powder onto wire stems and fabric petals to create realistic-looking leaves and flowers. These decorations were wildly popular. Every fashionable home had arrangements of these beautiful artificial flowers. The green powder that Matilda worked with every day was arsenic. She breathed it in with every breath. It settled on her skin, her clothes, her hands that she used to eat her lunch. She brought it home with her on her clothing, exposing her family. And after just a few months of this work, Matilda became violently ill. Her symptoms were horrific. She vomited green water, her body literally turning green from the inside out. Her eyes were covered with a green discharge. She convulsed and screamed in agony. A doctor was called, and when he examined her, he found that her fingernails had turned green. Her skin had a greenish tinge, and the whites of her eyes were no longer white. Matilda Scherer died in November 1861, her body saturated with arsenic from the beautiful green powder she had worked with. The newspapers covered her death, and for a brief moment there was public outcry about arsenic in dyes and decorations. But it did not last. The colour was too beautiful, the fashion was too strong, and manufacturers insisted that arsenic was only dangerous in the factory, not to the people who wore or lived with the finished products. They were lying, and people kept dying. The chemistry of arsenic-based green dyes is actually quite simple, which is partly why they were so popular. Scheele's green was invented in 1775 by Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele. It was made by mixing copper arsenite with sodium carbonate. Later, an even more virulent version called Paris green or emerald green was developed by mixing copper acetoarsenite with copper arsenite. These produced the most stunning, stable, vibrant greens that had ever been seen. Natural plant-based green dyes were expensive and faded quickly. Arsenic greens were cheap, brilliant, and permanent, so manufacturers used them in everything. Everything. Dresses, of course, but also wallpaper, which was hugely popular in Victorian homes. Entire rooms were covered in arsenical green wallpaper. The dining room might have a pattern of green leaves. The parlour might have green damask. Children's nurseries were decorated with cheerful green wallpaper featuring birds and flowers. And here is where it gets truly nightmarish. When the wallpaper got damp, from humidity, from condensation, from being in a poorly ventilated room, a fungus would grow in the paste that attached the paper to the wall. This fungus would metabolize the arsenic and release it as a gas. Arsine gas, one of the most toxic substances known to science. Families would go to bed in their beautiful green rooms and breathe in arsenic gas all night long. They would wake up with headaches, nausea, and a strange metallic taste in their mouths. Children would develop rashes and respiratory problems. Everyone would feel vaguely unwell, but no one connected it to the lovely green wallpaper on their walls. There are documented cases of entire families becoming chronically ill and finally recovering only after they moved houses. The wallpaper in their old home was killing them, but they never knew it because the connection between green dye and arsenic poisoning was not widely understood or accepted. One particularly tragic case involved a family in England where all 5 children became progressively sicker. The parents consulted doctor after doctor, but no one could determine the cause. Finally, one forward-thinking physician asked about their home environment and discovered that the children's nursery was papered in a bright green pattern. He advised removing the wallpaper immediately. Within weeks of the wallpaper being stripped away, the children began to recover. But one child, the youngest, had already suffered permanent neurological damage. Now back to the dresses, because this is where it becomes personal for the women who wore them. A woman in a green arsenic-dyed dress was wearing poison against her skin for hours at a time. If she perspired, which she certainly would while dancing at a ball or during a warm summer evening, the moisture would cause small amounts of arsenic to leach out of the fabric and be absorbed through her skin. And it was not just the wearer who was at risk. Anyone who came into physical contact with the dress, a dancing partner holding her around the waist, a child embracing her, a servant helping her dress, was also being exposed. The arsenic would come off on their hands. It would be in the air around the dress as fabric fluttered and moved. There are accounts from Victorian balls of women becoming ill during the evening. They would attribute it to the heat, to tight corseting, to too much excitement. But some of these fainting spells and sudden illnesses were actually acute arsenic poisoning from their own clothing. Dressmakers and seamstresses suffered terribly. They worked with arsenic-dyed fabric day after day, cutting it, sewing it, fitting it on clients. The fine dust of arsenic would float in the air of their workshops. They would inhale it, ingest it on their hands when they ate, absorb it through any cuts or scratches on their fingers. Many developed the telltale symptoms: skin lesions, hair loss, digestive problems, neurological issues. One London dressmaker reported that she and her workers always felt ill when working with green fabric. They would develop headaches and nausea that would only clear up on Sundays when the shop was closed. But they needed the work, and green dresses were fashionable, so they continued despite the obvious health effects. The medical community was divided on the issue of arsenic in clothing and home decorations. Some doctors sounded alarms, publishing articles about the dangers and documenting cases of poisoning, but other doctors, often those with financial connections to the dye industry, insisted that the amounts of arsenic were too small to cause harm, that any illness was coincidental, that the whole concern was overblown. This created confusion among the public. Should you avoid green dresses and wallpaper? Some authorities said yes, others said no. Manufacturers insisted their products were safe. Fashion magazines continued to feature green dresses prominently. So most people simply continued as they had been, choosing to believe the reassuring voices rather than the alarming ones. There were even demonstrations meant to prove that arsenical greens were safe. A chemist might show that a piece of green fabric did not immediately kill a mouse placed next to it. Therefore, it was safe for humans to wear. Of course, this ignored the reality of chronic low-level exposure over months and years, but it was enough to calm public concerns. The fashion industry had enormous financial incentive to deny the problem. Arsenic dyes were cheap and produced beautiful results. Admitting they were dangerous would require switching to more expensive alternatives and would scare customers away. So manufacturers fought against regulation and spread misinformation about the safety of their products. This is not so different from modern industries denying health hazards, is it? Tobacco companies insisting cigarettes were safe, fossil fuel companies denying climate change, opioid manufacturers claiming their drugs were not addictive. The pattern is always the same: profit versus public health, with powerful industries using their resources to confuse and delay action. But slowly the evidence became impossible to ignore. Too many dressmakers were dying. Too many children were getting sick in rooms with green wallpaper. Too many cases were being documented in medical journals. By the 1870s, awareness was growing, though change was slow. Some manufacturers began advertising their products as arsenic-free, which was telling. Why would you need to specify that unless arsenic-containing products were the norm? Queen Victoria herself reportedly refused to allow arsenical greens in her homes after being well informed of the dangers. This gave the safety movement legitimacy and encouraged others to follow suit. But fashion is stubborn, and beautiful deadly green remained popular through the 1880s and even into the 1890s in some circles. Women knew there was controversy about the colour. They had read the articles, they had heard the warnings, but green was so beautiful, so flattering, so fashionable. Many chose to wear it anyway, convincing themselves that the danger was exaggerated or that it would not affect them personally. There is a psychological phenomenon here that I find fascinating and sad. Victorian women were already sacrificing so much for beauty, wearing painful corsets, using poisonous cosmetics, enduring harmful medical treatments. Adding one more risk, especially for something as gorgeous as an emerald green gown, did not seem like such a big step. They'd already accepted that beauty required suffering. Why not this too? I think about a young woman preparing for her first ball. She has saved for months to afford a beautiful dress. The dressmaker shows her fabrics, and there it is, the most stunning emerald green silk she has ever seen. She knows there have been concerns about green dye. Her mother has mentioned it, but the dress is so beautiful. This is her chance to shine, to be noticed, to perhaps meet a suitable young man. She chooses the green silk. The dress is made. She wears it to the ball. She is radiant. Everyone compliments her gown. She dances all night, perspiring in the warm, crowded room, the arsenic leaching from her dress into her skin. She goes home exhausted but happy. And she has no idea that she has just exposed herself to poison, that years from now she might develop mysterious health problems, that she is part of a slow-motion tragedy affecting thousands of women. By the turn of the 20th century, arsenic-based dyes were finally being phased out and eventually banned in many countries. Safer synthetic dyes had been developed that could produce similar colours without the toxicity. The fashion industry moved on, but the damage had been done to generations of women and factory workers who had lived and worked with arsenical dyes. Some Victorian women who wore arsenic green dresses regularly may have contributed to their early deaths, without ever making the connection. That mysterious illness in her 30s could have been chronic arsenic exposure. That cancer in her 40s, arsenic is carcinogenic. Those neurological problems, classic arsenic poisoning symptoms, but without modern testing and awareness, these connections were never made. The story of arsenical green is a perfect microcosm of Victorian society's attitude toward women's health and safety. Beauty and fashion were valued above well-being. Women were expected to sacrifice for appearance. Commercial interests were prioritized over public health. And women themselves, conditioned by society's values, often made choices that harmed them because the alternative, being unfashionable, unattractive, unmarriageable, seemed worse. When I look at preserved Victorian green dresses in museum collections today, I wonder about the women who wore them. Did she know about the arsenic? Did she choose to ignore it? Did she become ill? Did she live a long life despite the exposure? Or did the dress contribute to her death? We will never know her story, but we know that she was part of a generation of women who literally wore poison in the name of fashion. And as horrifying as the poisonous green dresses were, they were part of a larger pattern of Victorian women sacrificing their health for beauty and social acceptance. Everything we have discussed, the infrequent bathing, the unwashed hair, the primitive menstrual management, the toxic cosmetics, the crushing corsets, the terrible dental care, the never-washed clothing, the harmful douching, the poisonous dresses, it all stems from the same root cause. Victorian society valued how women looked over how women felt, how they appeared over whether they were healthy, their marriageability over their well-being. And this brings us to our final topic, the culmination of everything we have explored. Because now we need to step back and ask ourselves, what does all of this teach us? What can we learn from the suffering of Victorian women? And perhaps most importantly, how much have things really changed? Before we reach our final reflections, I want to take you one more time into the everyday reality of a Victorian woman's life. But this time I want you to experience it as a complete picture. Because when you put all of these hygiene horrors together, when you really understand what it meant to live in a Victorian woman's body, the cumulative effect is staggering. Her name is Anne. She is 28 years old. It is a Tuesday morning in October 1878 in Baltimore, Maryland. Let me walk you through her day, and I want you to really feel what her life is like. Anne wakes up in her bedroom, which she shares with her husband. The chamber pot under the bed contains the waste from last night. She will need to carry it downstairs and empty it into the cesspool in the yard later, trying not to spill, trying not to be seen by anyone. For now, she pushes that task from her mind. She has not bathed in 9 days. Her last bath required her maid to carry bucket after bucket of water upstairs, heating them over the kitchen fire. The effort exhausted everyone involved, and the lukewarm water was only partially satisfying. She can feel the oily residue on her skin, the slight stickiness in places where her body folds. She takes a cloth and performs her morning sponge bath, washing her face, neck and underarms with cold water from the wash basin. The rest of her body will have to wait until her next proper bath, maybe this weekend if she can manage it. Her hair has not been washed in 3 weeks. It is pinned up in the elaborate style her maid created 5 days ago. Anne does not want to take it down because recreating the style takes hours. She can feel the grease at her scalp, the slight itch that never quite goes away. She ignores it. She has learned to ignore it. Tonight she will brush it 100 strokes before bed, as she does every night, distributing the oils and trying to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. Anne is on the 4th day of her menstrual period. She is wearing a cloth pad, one she made herself from old sheets, held in place by pins attached to her split-crotch drawers. The pad is already damp and uncomfortable. She will need to change it midday, washing the soiled one in cold water in her bedroom and hoping it dries enough by evening to use again. She only has 3 pads total. She cannot bathe during her period, of course. The doctors have warned her that water during menstruation could cause hysteria or stop the flow, backing the blood into her body. So she endures the discomfort, the smell, the constant worry about leaking. Her teeth hurt. 1 molar on the left side has been aching for 2 weeks. She knows it is probably rotting, but she cannot bring herself to visit the dentist. The last time she had a tooth pulled, the barber nearly had to break it out of her jaw, and the pain was beyond description. So she chews on the right side and tries to ignore the throbbing. She has already lost 4 teeth at 28. She is terrified of losing more, but she is also terrified of the extraction process. She rubs salt across her teeth with her finger, her morning dental routine. The grittiness reminds her that she needs to have the cook buy more salt. She rinses her mouth with water from the pitcher and hopes that the tooth does not get worse. Now comes the process of getting dressed. First, her chemise, the thin white cotton undergarment that is the only thing she washes regularly. At least this is clean. Then her split-crotch drawers, then her corset. Anne's maid helps her into the corset and begins lacing. Anne has been wearing corsets since she was 12 years old. Her natural waist would be about 26 inches, but her corset compresses it to 20 inches. She can feel the familiar squeeze as the maid pulls the laces tight. Her ribs compress, her organs shift. She takes a shallow breath, the only kind of breath possible when corseted, and nods that it is tight enough. The corset is not clean. She's been wearing it for weeks, and it has absorbed her sweat day after day. There is no way to wash it without destroying its shape and structure. It smells faintly of her body, but she is so accustomed to this smell that she barely notices it anymore. Everyone's corsets smell. This is normal. Over the corset go her petticoats, multiple layers to create the proper silhouette. Then finally her dress. It is a deep blue wool, one of her nicer day dresses. She has worn it at least 20 times. It has never been washed. There is a small stain on the bodice where she spilled tea 3 weeks ago. She spot cleaned it with benzene, but you can still see the mark if you look closely. The underarms of the dress are stiff with accumulated sweat. The hem is dirty from brushing against floors and streets, but she brushes it vigorously with a stiff brush, picks off any visible lint or dirt and puts it on. It is as clean as it will ever be. Before leaving her room, Anne applies her cosmetics. She uses a powder that contains lead to achieve a pale complexion. She can see in the mirror that her skin looks a bit grey and dull. The powder is actually damaging her skin, but she does not know this. She thinks the greyness is a natural flaw that requires more powder to cover. She also applies a tiny amount of rouge to her cheeks, careful to blend it so it looks natural. Society disapproves of obvious makeup. She has been taking arsenic complexion wafers for 6 months now. She bought them from the Sears catalogue. They promise to make her skin translucent and beautiful, and she thinks they might be working, though she has also noticed she gets headaches more frequently, and her hands sometimes tingle. She assumes this is nerves, or perhaps she needs new gloves that fit better. Anne goes downstairs to breakfast. She eats very little. Her corseted stomach cannot hold much food, and eating too much causes pain as her compressed organs protest. A bit of toast, some weak tea with too much sugar. This is typical. She is often hungry but unable to eat normally. After breakfast, she must empty the chamber pot. This task fills her with dread every single day. The humiliation of carrying her waste through the house, even though everyone does it. The fear of spilling, the smell. She does it quickly, dumps it in the cesspool, and tries not to think about it. The rest of her morning is spent on household management. She checks with the cook about dinner. She goes over accounts, she does some needlework, but the entire time she is aware of multiple discomforts. The corset makes it hard to breathe. Her menstrual pad is damp and chafing. Her tooth aches. Her scalp itches from 3 weeks of unwashed hair. She needs to urinate, but the thought of hiking up all her layers and hovering over the chamber pot again is unappealing, so she holds it. In the afternoon she has a social call to make. She puts on her hat and gloves, picks up her parasol to protect her skin from the sun. Pale skin is crucial, and she cannot let it darken, and walks the 3 blocks to her friend's house. The visit is pleasant. She and her friend sit in the parlour and talk about safe topics, the weather, mutual acquaintances, plans for the church social. They do not discuss anything personal. They do not mention that they both need to urinate, but are too polite to ask to use the chamber pot in their friend's home. They do not mention menstruation, or the fact that both of them are probably wearing dresses they have never washed, or that their teeth hurt, or that they can barely breathe in their corsets. They sit with perfect posture, the corsets enforce this, and maintain pleasant expressions. Their lead-based face paint would crack if they smiled too broadly. When Anne returns home, she is exhausted. The walk, while short, has left her breathless. Her corset makes any exertion difficult. She has a headache, possibly from oxygen deprivation, possibly from the arsenic she has been ingesting, possibly from the lead in her face powder. She does not know that her beauty routine is poisoning her. In the evening, after dinner that she could barely eat, Anne prepares for bed. She removes her dress and brushes it carefully before hanging it in the wardrobe. It will be worn again, and again, until it literally falls apart or goes out of style. She removes her corset with relief, feeling her ribs expand, taking deep breaths for the first time all day. The skin underneath has red marks and some raw spots from the constant pressure. This is normal. Everyone has these marks. She changes her menstrual pad one more time, rinsing the soiled one and hanging it to dry near the bedroom fire. She performs her intimate hygiene, douching with an alum solution that burns slightly. She has been taught this is necessary for cleanliness and health. She does not know she is disrupting her body's natural defences and setting herself up for infections. She brushes her hair 100 strokes, as she does every night. Her arm aches by a stroke 75, but she persists. This is what women do to maintain their crowning glory. The brush comes away greasy. She tries not to think about it. Finally, she puts on her nightgown and climbs into bed. Her tooth is throbbing, her scalp itches, her menstrual cramps are getting worse. The raw spots where her corset rubbed are stinging. She is tired but uncomfortable. And this is a good day, a normal day. Anne is a comfortable middle-class woman with a maid to help her, a decent wardrobe and enough money to buy complexion wafers and cosmetics. Her life is easier than that of a working-class woman who might be labouring in a factory in addition to all of these struggles. Can you imagine living this life day after day, year after year, from adolescence until old age? Because this is what Victorian women did. This was normal, this was expected. This was what it meant to be a proper, respectable woman. And here is what breaks my heart. Anne thinks she is doing everything right. She is following all the rules of hygiene and beauty as her society has taught them to her. She is being a good woman. She would be shocked to learn that most of what she is doing is either useless or actively harmful. Her infrequent bathing is not a choice but a practical reality. Her unwashed hair is standard practice. Her primitive menstrual management is the best available. Her painful corset is required by fashion and reinforced by doctors. Her poisonous cosmetics are marketed as safe and beautiful. Her douching routine is recommended by medical authorities. Her never-washed dress is normal because washing would destroy it. She is trapped in a system that values her appearance over her health, her marriageability over her comfort, her conformity over her well-being. And the terrible thing is that she has internalized these values. She judges herself by these standards. She feels shame when she falls short of them. This is what oppression looks like when it is so normalized that it becomes invisible. When the victims enforce it on themselves and each other. When everyone is suffering but no one questions whether it has to be this way. Victorian women were not weak or foolish or particularly different from us. They were doing their best within a system that was stacked against them. They made rational choices based on the information they had and the constraints they faced. They survived. They raised children. They managed households. They created art and literature. They lived full lives despite all of these challenges, but they also suffered unnecessarily. They died earlier than they should have. They experienced chronic health problems that were preventable. They lived with constant discomfort that we can barely imagine, and most of them never knew that it did not have to be this way. When I think about Anne, going to bed exhausted, uncomfortable, in pain, believing this is just what life is like for women, I feel profound sadness. But I also feel profound gratitude. Gratitude for the medical advances that have freed us from so much of this suffering. Gratitude for the feminists who fought to change these oppressive standards. Gratitude for the simple fact that I live now and not then. But that gratitude comes with a question that we cannot ignore. A question that makes all of this history suddenly, uncomfortably relevant to our own lives. Because while things have certainly improved, have they really changed as much as we think they have? And what might future generations say about our own hygiene practices, our own beauty standards, our own willingness to suffer for appearance? So here we are, at the end of our journey through Victorian women's hygiene. We have seen the infrequent bathing, the monthly hair washing, the primitive menstrual management, the chamber pots and outhouses, the poisonous cosmetics, the crushing corsets, the terrible dental care, the never-washed clothing, the harmful douching, the deadly green dresses, and the daily reality of living in a body that society demanded be both beautiful and denied basic care. And now I want you to consider something uncomfortable. Something that might make you squirm a little bit. Because while we can look back at Victorian women with pity and horror, can we honestly say we are so different? Think about the beauty standards we follow today, the procedures we undergo, the products we use without fully understanding their long-term effects, the discomfort we accept as normal. Are we really so free from the patterns that trapped Victorian women? Consider cosmetic surgery, Breast implants, facelifts, liposuction, Brazilian butt lifts. These procedures carry real risks: infection, nerve damage, even death. Every year, women die from cosmetic procedures, yet millions of women choose them anyway because society tells them their natural bodies are not good enough. Is this so different from Victorian women eating arsenic wafers for pale skin? Or think about modern beauty products. We like to believe they are safe because we have regulations now. But how many products contain chemicals whose long-term effects we do not fully understand? Parabens, phthalates, formaldehyde-releasing preservatives. We spread these on our skin daily, trusting that someone has tested them properly, that regulations are protecting us. Victorian women trusted their doctors and manufacturers too. What about shapewear? Those modern versions of corsets that compress and reshape our bodies. Yes, they are less extreme than Victorian corsets, but we still squeeze ourselves into uncomfortable garments that restrict movement and breathing because we want the right silhouette. We still prioritize appearance over comfort. We still believe our natural body shape needs correction, or consider hair removal. Victorian society expected women to be hairless in certain areas, and we've only intensified that expectation. Women today spend thousands of dollars and countless hours removing body hair through painful procedures: waxing, laser treatments, electrolysis. We have normalized a level of hair removal that would have seemed extreme even to Victorians, and we do it because society tells us that natural female body hair is disgusting and unfeminine. Think about teeth. Yes, modern dentistry is vastly better than Victorian tooth pulling, but we have also created new insecurities. Teeth must not just be healthy but perfectly white, straight, symmetrical. We bleach them with chemicals. We put teenagers through years of painful orthodontics. We veneer and cap and straighten until every smile looks identical. Victorian women lost teeth to decay. Modern women alter healthy teeth to meet beauty standards. And what about menstruation? We have better products now, thankfully, but we still teach girls to be ashamed of their periods. We still use euphemisms and whisper about it. We still market products that promise to make periods invisible, odorless, as if they do not exist. The shame may be less than Victorian times, but it has not disappeared. It has just evolved. The fashion industry still pushes trends that harm us. Sky-high heels that damage feet and spines. Restrictive clothing that limits movement. Fabrics treated with chemicals we cannot pronounce. We know that fast fashion is terrible for the environment and often made in sweatshops where workers suffer. Yet we keep buying because we want to be fashionable, just like Victorian women wanted to wear arsenic green even when they knew it was dangerous. Social media has created beauty pressures that Victorian women never faced. We compare ourselves to filtered, edited, surgically enhanced images. We agonize over our appearance in ways that would make sense to a Victorian woman because the underlying psychology is the same. We internalize beauty standards that are impossible to meet naturally, then shame ourselves for falling short. Even our relationship with cleanliness has its own issues. We may bathe too frequently, stripping away protective oils. We may over-sanitize, disrupting our microbiomes. We douche, even though modern doctors tell us not to. Yes, douching is still common in many communities despite clear medical evidence that it is harmful. The Victorian pattern of ignoring medical advice in favour of what we believe or what is marketed to us continues. I am not saying we are just as bad off as Victorian women. Obviously, we have made tremendous progress. We have safer products, better medical care, more knowledge and more choices. A modern woman's hygiene options and health outcomes are infinitely better than those of her Victorian counterpart. But the underlying dynamic, the willingness to sacrifice health for beauty, to suffer for social acceptance, to follow trends despite knowing they are harmful, that has not changed as much as we might like to believe. Victorian women knew arsenic was poisonous, yet they ate it anyway. We know tanning beds cause cancer, yet people use them for that perfect glow. Victorian women knew corsets damage their organs, yet they laced them tight anyway. We know high heels damage our feet and backs, yet we wear them because they are required for professional settings or make our legs look better. Victorian women used products with unknown ingredients, hoping they were safe. We do the same with the countless new cosmetic chemicals introduced every year. The patterns persist because the root cause persists. As long as society judges women primarily on appearance, as long as beauty is tied to worth and opportunity, women will make choices that prioritize how they look over how they feel. But here is where I find hope. Because we are talking about it now in ways that Victorian women could not. We are questioning these standards, we are pushing back. The body positivity movement, the natural beauty movement, the growing awareness of toxic beauty standards. These are modern versions of the Victorian dress reform movement, but with more momentum and more voices. Every time a woman refuses to dye her grey hair, she is pushing back against the standard that women must appear forever young. Every time someone shares an unfiltered photo on social media, they are challenging unrealistic beauty standards. Every time a woman prioritizes comfort over appearance, she is making a small rebellion that Victorian women would understand and applaud. We are also learning from history in ways that give me hope. The Victorian era taught us what happens when profit is prioritized over health, when beauty standards go unchallenged, when women's bodies are treated as things to be corrected rather than respected. We are still learning these lessons, but we are learning. Modern medicine understands women's bodies better. Not perfectly, but better. We know that the vagina is self-cleaning. We know that natural body odor is not a disease requiring constant intervention. We know that diverse body types are healthy and normal. This knowledge empowers us to make better choices than Victorian women could. We also have something Victorian women desperately lacked: the ability to share information freely. Victorian women suffered in isolation, never realizing that their neighbours were experiencing the same problems, that the remedies they were using were causing harm. We can talk to each other now, we can share experiences, we can warn each other about harmful products or practices. This collective knowledge is powerful, but we cannot be complacent. Because every generation thinks they've escaped the mistakes of the previous one, only to discover they have fallen into similar traps wearing different disguises. Victorian women thought they were more enlightened than Georgian women who had used even more lead in their makeup. We think we are more enlightened than Victorian women. But are we really? Or have we just found new ways to harm ourselves in the name of beauty? The story of Victorian women's hygiene is ultimately a story about the price women pay when their worth is determined by their appearance rather than their health, their comfort, their happiness, or their humanity. It is a story about how suffering becomes normalized when everyone is doing it. It is a story about how commercial interests exploit insecurity. It is a story about how shame keeps people isolated and unable to help each other. But it is also a story about resilience, because despite everything, despite the pain, the discomfort, the danger, the suffering, Victorian women lived, they loved, they created, they persevered. They found joy and meaning in their lives despite the tremendous physical burdens they carried. When I think about all of those millions of Victorian women going about their daily lives in bodies that were corseted, unwashed, poisoned and in pain, I feel such respect for their strength. They did what they had to do. They survived in a world that was not designed for their well-being, and I think about how many of them would be astounded and overjoyed by what we have now: indoor plumbing, hot showers, washing machines, safe cosmetics, modern menstrual products, dental anesthesia, the ability to bathe daily, wash our hair whenever we want, wear comfortable clothes, walk around uncorseted, eat until we are full, smile without fear of cracking face paint or showing missing teeth. These are not small things, these are tremendous improvements in quality of life that Victorian women would have considered miraculous. We should not take them for granted. We should honour the women who suffered without these things by appreciating and protecting the progress we have made. But we should also use their story as a warning. We should ask ourselves constantly, what are we doing right now that future generations will look back on with horror? What suffering have we normalized? What harmful practices have we accepted because everyone is doing them? What are we sacrificing for beauty or social acceptance that we will later recognize was not worth the cost? The Victorian era ended more than a century ago, but its lessons remain urgent and relevant. The human capacity to harm ourselves in pursuit of beauty has not diminished. The willingness of industries to profit from insecurity has not changed. The tendency to shame and police women's bodies continues, but our capacity to question, to resist, to choose differently, that is also still with us. Every time we prioritize health over appearance, comfort over fashion, authenticity over perfection, we are breaking the patterns that trapped Victorian women. Every time we challenge harmful beauty standards, we are fighting a battle that Victorian dress reformers began. The Victorian women we have learned about tonight, the ones who bathed weekly at best, who washed their hair monthly, who managed their periods with rags, who wore poisonous makeup and deadly dresses, who corseted themselves until they could barely breathe, they deserve to be remembered. Not just for their suffering, but for their strength. Not just with pity, but with understanding. They were doing their best in a world that gave them terrible choices, and perhaps the best way to honour them is to make better choices ourselves. To question the beauty standards we are handed, to prioritise our health and comfort, to support other women instead of judging them, to remember that our worth is not determined by how we look, how we smell, or whether we meet some arbitrary standard of beauty. Because in the end, that is the real lesson of Victorian women's hygiene. Not that they were dirty or foolish or weak, but that they were human beings who deserved better than they got. And so are we. Thank you for going on this journey with me tonight. I know it has not been easy. Some of these stories have been genuinely disturbing. But I believe it is important that we know them, that we understand what women have endured, that we learn from history so we do not repeat its mistakes. I hope you sleep well tonight in your comfortable clothes, in your clean bed, knowing you can shower in the morning if you want, knowing you have choices that Victorian women could only dream of. But I also hope you sleep with a new awareness, an awareness of the patterns that persist, determination to break them, a commitment to making choices that honour your health and well-being, not just your appearance. And I hope you will join me again soon for another journey into history's hidden corners. Because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more lessons to learn from the women who came before us. Until then, take care of yourselves. Truly take care, in ways that Victorian women could not. Good night, and remember, you are more than your appearance. You always have been. You always will be.